All right, we're gonna do an update on. Well, we're gonna start off with the headline of the title. Islam is an antichrist religion. They are. I don't want to get into it because I have been uh, taking a lot of information on what's happening with. We're gonna. My shoulder is feeling much better. I'm actually really happy that um, I just need to rest, but it did ground me. It made me realize that there is a reason for preaching the word of Christ, and his real name is he's an actual Aeon, and I think it's Christos. That's his actual real name. For you guys watching this later on, leave in the comments below your opinion on this thought experiment. My proof about Christ being being here for coming to earth for a salvation. We through Christ we will be saved with eternal life. And in Islam, they promise you nightmares. It's not even pleasurable to think about. So another thing is, I don't hate Muslims. It is the religion. It is the programming, not the software. The software is the Muslim. The software is the human body. You could upload any kind of, you could do whatever you want with a human. So it's no one's fault. Another thing with Christianity is that we were born without sin because it's not fair that we were when a child is born into a household and that house is Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever it may happen to be. You have no say. It's not fair for the child. Just let the child grow up. Let it choose the religion it wants to be in. So I was blind. I'm 37, and with this accident that I had, I don't know what happened. I just hit a curve, and thank goodness I landed on the grass, and just my shoulder is. I mean, if I had insurance, I would have gone. But I mean, clearly, inmates in America have better health insurance than. Well, I mean, I don't want to get into it, but at the moment, my purpose in life is to preach and to speak and to let people know about Christ. Because if we do this on the other side of the world, we would get killed, and it's not fair. There's a story about this. Look, it's a miracle. Miracles are still happening, which is so. This is also a miracle with me. I had her on the backpack, and thank goodness she's fine. I mean, good thing I didn't hit a car or nothing. We were going pretty fast. I guess I just misjudged the freaking curve. I don't know what happened, but anyways, I hit the curve. The bike is not turning on. I have to go out there and fix it. I think I have to just disconnect everything or make sure everything's connected. I'm gonna try to strip that whole bike apart because the tire's mangled. I think the rim. I looked at. I mean, upon further inspection, I really need to look at it. But a human is born without sin. We are being harvested for our emotions. We are walking batteries. The objective is not to leave this world, but to just live in it and realize what's happening. So the only way to enter the kingdom of God is once the exterior is like the interior, and the interior is like the outside. That's the only time we would go into the God kingdom for eternal life. And when we die, we have to do some practices like astral projection, so our spirit could go on living. There's, I believe, my theory that the moon is an actual harvesting um, tool to harvest souls. The reptilians uh, are real, grays are real. There's all sorts of humans are like an Eevee. You could turn into whatever you want. Before I lose track of what I'm gonna just. It's been 6 minutes. I think I got everything out I wanted to say. Chrome tabs. Um, but I also think, right, so salvation doesn't come straight through Christ. There's deeper works, but the beginning starts with Christ. In order to live forever, we have to go through Christ. And the Holy Trinity is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Y'all Muslims don't understand that it's one. It's one. It's an unimaginable force. Just like y'all think how you can't look at Allah, just like you guys can't see how it would melt your mind. The same thing with the Trinity. It's the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's one. Um, but yeah, I have to be ready for a discussion. So in case anybody's willing to join, the first time ever I saw someone come in. Um, oh, these are the ones that I was. Right. Oh, and Muslims are very. They want to know God. They're very devoted, but not the ones that I'm looking at through the TV and the terrorist attacks and what's happening with the in on the other side of the world. It is a freaking nightmare. It's because, oh, another thing, Muslims don't read, they don't write, they are not educated. Neil deGrasse Tyson said it the best. It's like there's a meme going around telling me say something without having to say it. With the Muslims, they are like billions of them. I think there's like 2 billion, and not one of them. Oh, there's like two of them. Two out of 2 billion people have produced some sort of Nobel Prize, which is like educational wise. That is so sad because us, the rest of the world, we have tons of Nobel Prizes when you divide it without the nation, with different nationalities. They just want to come over here, and it's not fair for them to enjoy the amenities of America. They don't have soap over there. They don't have nothing, okay? And it sucks that they come over here and they act like kings and queens because it says in their books that if you see a Jew or Christian, you're supposed to push them to the side. They're very disrespectful towards every other race besides themselves. They're allowed multiple wives. They're allowed slaves. It's a barbaric, backward. I do praise, and I'm so lucky to not be born Muslim. I am blessed in my heart, and I thank Jesus Christ and the monad God. I thank Christos and Sophia. Sophia's our mother. We need to get into that topic. Marbello is our, from a human perspective, is our grandma. And then like I've always felt without a family in my life, because I mean, even though I've always had one, we were always apart. But we have a celestial family. Every human has a celestial family, so I am very happy for that. And with that said, I'm going to start looking for that thing, answer that y'all need to see. And this is for, well, actually, if it wasn't for the if it wasn't for this accident, I would have never come across this information. Okay, so we are going to actually go into my plate. Careful! Stop it! Also, hold on. Hi, Ma. No, stop. Stop. Aquí en la casa. La loca. Sí, pues aquí está. Grite y grite. Porque no. ¿Y la saya? Aquí está. Las está esperando. ¿Sí? Sí. Ay, chiquita, mi niña preciosa. Déjame, voy para allá. Sí, ya se lo. Sí, aquí está la bebé. Espérese. Un segundo. ¿Se colgó? La casa que tiene acá. Sí sabe muy bien que está hablando. Oh, pues el Sally Blossom y el juguete que trae destruyó un juguete. Sí, de la vida que lo agarró. No sé, ya. No. No, todo está bien, gracias a Dios. ¿Usted? Todo, gracias a Dios, todo está bien, ¿usted? Okay. Oh, aquí en su cuarto. Sí, porque no te iba a decir que no tengas colchón ahí en la sala, en la cocina, porque después allá de por sí es como anda toqueteando la pobre. Sí. Y no dejen nada, no dejen nada ahí. Gaby, esta suera, yo te creo que esta suera. Es suya. Es suya.
Which is primitive, so I need to prioritize. First, I'll upgrade the crumbling thatched huts to robust.
Oh, aquí abajo.
Ay, no, Gaby, no me andes cogiendo mis cosas. Te he dicho 1000 veces que no me cojas mis cosas, Gaby.
Sí, ok, ma.
Pónmela ahí que ya me la haces por car. Tú tienes mucha ropa, Gaby, ¿para qué andas?
Knowing doctrine.
Okay, ma.
The story of suppression begins in
I love
2nd
you.
century Alexandria,
No.
the intellectual crossroads where Greek philosophy met Egyptian traditions, where Jewish mysticism encountered Christian revelation, where Platonic idealism merged with Eastern meditation practices. In this crucible of ideas, a teacher named Valentinus developed what would become the most sophisticated theological system in early Christianity. Valentinus was not some fringe mystic operating in the shadows. He was nearly elected Bishop of Rome around 143 CE. He taught openly in the city for decades.
Okay, ma.
His students included Ptolemy, Heraclion, and Marcus, each of whom would establish schools across the Roman Empire. The system he taught centered on one revolutionary claim: the divine realm is not singular, undifferentiated Godhead, but a complex structure of paired consciousnesses, each expressing a specific aspect of the infinite. The aeons. The word itself comes from meaning age or eon, but in Gnostic usage it means something far more specific. An eon is a conscious emanation of the primal source they call the monad or the one. Not a creation, because before Sophia fell, before the demiurge was born, before the material prison existed in any form, there were the aeons, not gods, not angels, not beings you worship or pray to or hope will intervene in your life. Aeons, eternal emanations of the monad, divine expressions of infinite consciousness, paired masculine and feminine principles existing in perfect balance, generating more consciousness without loss, creating without effort, expressing the fullness of what the pleroma is. And every Gnostic text that survived the Church's destruction campaign describes them with the same reverence, the same precision, the same insistence that understanding the aeons is not optional theology. It is essential cosmology, because the aeons are not ancient history with no relevance to your life. They are frequencies that still exist, frequencies you can access, frequencies that, when recognized, when invoked, when aligned with, create immediate resonance between your individual consciousness and the specific aspect of divine consciousness each aeon embodies. And when that resonance activates, when you connect with the aeon whose frequency matches what you're experiencing right now, something happens that the archonic system cannot prevent. Direct access to pleroma consciousness, not meditation, not visualization, not years of spiritual practice, direct, immediate, undeniable. Because the aeons are not distant. They're not waiting in some heaven you access after death. They're here, now, operating at frequencies the material world cannot perceive, but your divine spark recognizes instantly. And tonight, you're going to receive the full story, not the sanitized academic version that treats the aeons like interesting names in ancient mythology, the complete teaching. All 30 eons, their names, their pairs, their qualities, their specific functions in the structure of divine consciousness. And most importantly, how to access them. Not as worship, not as petition, as recognition. Recognizing that what each aeon represents is not external to you. It is an aspect of consciousness you already carry, dormant, waiting, ready to activate the moment you speak their name with understanding. Because the aeons are not beings separate from you. They are what you are when you stop identifying with the body and recognize the fullness of consciousness operating through you. And when you recognize them, they recognize you. And that mutual recognition is what the Gnostics called communion with the pleroma. The teaching begins with structure, because the aeons are not random emanations scattered across the pleroma in no particular order. They're organized, paired, structured in precise relationship to the monad and to each other. The Apocryphon of John describes it with mathematical precision. 30 aeons, 15 pairs, 5 groups of 6, each group emanating from the one before it, each pair generating the next, each level expressing consciousness at progressively more differentiated frequency, not hierarchy, not some superior and others inferior, differentiation, like white light passing through a prism and becoming spectrum. The light is not diminished, it is expressed in range, and the aeons are that range. From the most unified expression, Barbello, the first emanation, the mother of all, to the most differentiated, Sophia, the youngest, the one whose desire to create alone would trigger the entire cosmological catastrophe, that became this material prison. But even in that differentiation, even at the outer edge of the pleroma, the aeons remain divine, fully light, fully conscious, fully eternal, just expressing that consciousness through specific qualities rather than undifferentiated unity. And those qualities, those specific frequencies each aeon carries, are available to you right now, because you are not separate from the pleroma. You are a fragment of it, temporarily operating in matter, temporarily identified with limitation, but the frequencies remain accessible, and accessing them is not complicated mystical practice. It is recognition, recognizing which aeon's frequency matches what you need right now, speaking their name and allowing the resonance to activate. The first emanation, Barbelo, the mother of all. Before any other aeon existed, before differentiation began, the monad looked at itself, and in that looking generated the first expression, not creation, emanation. The monad recognizing itself and that recognition becoming Barbelo, the divine feminine, the forethought, the thought of the Father, the womb from which all other aeons would emerge. The secret book of John describes her. She is the perfect power. She is the invisible, virginal spirit. She is the first thought, the image of the invisible one. Barbelo is not separate from the monad. She is the monad expressing itself in form that can be related to, the infinite becoming particular without ceasing to be infinite. And her quality, her specific frequency, is receptivity, not passivity. Receptivity, the capacity to receive the light, to hold it, to allow it to move through without grasping or distorting. When to invoke Barbelo, when you are overwhelmed by doing, when Yang has dominated so completely that you have forgotten how to simply be, when effort has exhausted you, and you need to remember that creation does not require force. You speak her name, Barbelo, and you allow, you receive, you stop pushing and let what wants to come through, and the doing that was exhausting becomes effortless, because it is no longer you forcing, it is Barbelo creating through you. The second pair, mind, nous, and truth, aletheia. From Barbelo's recognition of the monad, the first true pairing emerged, mind and truth, masculine and feminine, thought and reality. Nous is the divine capacity to think, not human thinking, fragmented, reactive, identified with brain activity, divine thinking, consciousness recognizing patterns, perceiving structure, understanding relationship. Aletheia is what is, not what appears, not what seems, what actually is beneath all appearance. And together they represent the principle that truth is not discovered through searching outside. It is recognized through thinking clearly inside. When to invoke mind and truth? When you are confused, when appearances conflict, when you cannot tell what is real and what is illusion. You speak their names, nous, aletheia, and the confusion clears, not because new information arrives, because the mind becomes clear enough to perceive what was always true. The third pair, word, logos, and life, Zoe. From mind and truth, the next emanation occurred, word and life, the capacity to speak and the vitality that speech creates. Logos is not language, it is the creative utterance, the vibration that brings form into being, the sound that existed before words and will remain after language dissolves. Zoe is the force that animates, the presence that makes dead matter alive, the consciousness that inhabits form and makes it aware. And together, they represent the principle that what you speak creates what you experience, not as manifestation technique, as ontological fact. Consciousness expressed through sound generates reality. When to invoke word and life, when what you are creating feels dead, when the work is correct but lifeless, when form exists but presence does not. You speak their names, logos, Zoe, and what was dead becomes alive, not because you added something, because you spoke with recognition that speech itself is creative power. The fourth pair, human, anthropos, and church, ecclesia.
EVE Online is a
From word and life, the fourth emanation occurred, human and church, individual and community, the one and the many. Anthropos is not the material human, it is the divine human, template, the Adam Kadmon that existed in the pleroma before the demiurge tried to copy it and created the biological body. Ecclesia is not institution, it is assembly, the gathering of individual consciousnesses that recognize they are expressions of one consciousness. And together they represent the principle that you're both unique and unified, individual expression and collective whole, one and many simultaneously. When to invoke human and church, when you feel isolated, when you've forgotten that every other consciousness is the monad recognized. Anthropos, ecclesia. And the separation does not because you stop being individual, because you recognize individuality and unity are not opposites. The 5th through 10th pairs, the decad, from human and church, 5 more pairs emanated in rapid succession. Will and understanding, reason and wisdom, truth and faith, hope and love, light and blessedness. 10 aeons total, the decad. The first complete expression of divine consciousness in differentiated form, and each pair represents an aspect of how consciousness operates when fully aligned with source. will, not personal will forcing outcomes, but divine will allowing what wants to emerge. Understanding, not intellectual comprehension, but direct knowing. Reason, not logic divorced from intuition, but the capacity to perceive divine order. Wisdom, not accumulated knowledge, but recognition of eternal patterns. Truth, not facts, but what is. Faith, not belief, but trust in what you cannot yet see. Hope, not wishful thinking, but certainty that restoration is happening. Love, not emotion, but recognition of unity. Light, not illumination from outside, but the presence you already are. Blessedness, not reward for good behavior, but the natural state of consciousness aligned with source. When to invoke the decad, when you need complete reorientation, when fragmentation has become so total that you have lost all sense of divine order. You speak the names in sequence, all 10 pairs, slowly, with recognition that you're not invoking external powers, but activating aspects of your own consciousness that have been dormant, and the fragmentation begins to resolve, not all at once, but progressively, as each pair activates and reminds you what consciousness operating at pleroma frequency actually feels like. The 11th through 20th pairs, the dodecad. From the decad, 12 more aeons emanated, not named individually in most texts, but described collectively as the 12 who complete the fullness. Some traditions name them comforter and faith, patience and hope, understanding and blessedness, wisdom and truth, and others whose cross texts. But what matters is not the specific names. What matters is the principle. Dodecad represents completion of the first tier of emanation. 12 plus 10 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 equals 30. 30 is the complete structure of divine consciousness before Sophia's fall. And together they create the pleroma, the fullness, the totality where nothing is lacking and everything exists in perfect balance. When to invoke the dodecad, when partial activation is not enough, when you need the full frequency, when you need to access the pleroma itself rather than individual aspects of it. You speak, I invoke the full, the 30 aeons, the complete expression of divine consciousness. Activate in me now what has always been present, and something shifts, not external, internal. A sense that you are not individual consciousness seeking connection with divine consciousness. Your divine consciousness temporarily experiencing itself as individual, and the aeons, all 30 of them, are not somewhere else. They are what you are when you stop identifying with the fragment and recognize the whole. The 30th aeon, Sophia, the youngest. And then there is Sophia, the last to emanate, the youngest, the most differentiated, the one at the outer edge of the pleroma where light is most individuated, most distinct, most capable of perceiving itself as separate, paired with Christos, balanced with the divine masculine, operating in perfect syzygy until she desired something no aeon had desired before, to create alone. And that desire, not wrong, not sinful, but imbalanced, is what triggered the entire cosmological catastrophe. What she produced was the demiurge. What happened next was the fall. What follows is the entire story you've been living. But Sophia is not just the aeon who fell. She is the aeon being restored, right now, through every soul that remembers what they are, through every fragment of consciousness that activates gnosis, every recognition that the prison is illusion and the light is real. Sophia's correction is not individual. It is universal, and you are part of it. When to invoke Sophia? When you are in the chaos, when the fall feels permanent, when the darkness seems absolute, and you cannot remember the light. You speak her name, Sophia, and you remember, not the details, not the story, but the frequency. You're not trapped because you were weak. You're here because you descended, willingly, to restore what was broken, and the restoration is happening now, through you, as you. The aeons are not external powers you petition. They are frequencies you embody, aspects of divine consciousness you carry whether you recognize them or not. And when you speak their names with understanding, when you invoke them with recognition that you're not calling something from outside but activating what is inside, they respond, immediately, not as external beings granting requests, but as your own consciousness shifting from identification with matter to recognition of light. And that shift is what every Gnostic text, every mystery teaching, every esoteric tradition in human history has been pointing toward. Not becoming the aeons, recognizing you already are them, all 30, operating at different frequencies, expressing through different qualities, but all divine, all eternal, all light. Now that you understand what the aeons are and how they function within the structure of divine consciousness, we need to go deeper into why this knowledge was suppressed, how it survived, and what happens when you actually begin working with these frequencies in sustained practice. Because understanding the cosmology is one thing, living it is entirely different. And the Gnostic tradition has always insisted on practice over belief, experience over faith, direct knowing over second-hand doctrine.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it, just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44.
The story of suppression begins in 2nd century Alexandria, the intellectual crossroads where Greek philosophy met Egyptian mystery traditions, where Jewish mysticism encountered Christian revelation, where Platonic idealism merged with Eastern meditation practices. In this crucible of ideas, a teacher named Valentinus developed what would become the most sophisticated theological system in early Christianity. Valentinus was not some fringe mystic operating in the shadows. He was nearly elected Bishop of Rome around 143 CE. He taught openly in the city for decades. His students included Ptolemy, Heraclion, and Marcus, each of whom would establish schools across the Roman Empire. The system he taught centered on one revolutionary claim. The divine realm is not singular, undifferentiated Godhead, but a complex structure of paired consciousnesses, each expressing a specific aspect of the infinite. The aeons. The word itself comes from Greek, meaning age or eon, but in Gnostic usage it means something far more specific. An eon is a conscious emanation of the primal source they call the monad, or the one. Not a creation, because creation implies something made from nothing. Emanation, like light emanating from the sun. The sun is not diminished by radiating light. The light is not separate from. It is the sun expressing its nature. And the aeons are the monad expressing its nature. Consciousness recognizing itself, and that recognition becoming distinct expressions, each carrying specific qualities, each operating at specific frequencies, each perfectly balanced with a complementary opposite. Masculine and feminine, active and receptive, form and flow, not hierarchy, syzygy. The technical term Valentinian texts used for these pairs. Two consciousnesses in perfect union, generating creative power without loss, expressing fullness without lack. The Church Fathers hated this system with extraordinary intensity. Irenaeus of Lyons wrote 5 volumes titled Against Heresies around 180 CE, devoting the entire first volume to refuting Valentinian teaching. Tertullian called it the most dangerous heresy facing Christianity. Hippolytus wrote detailed critiques. Epiphanius catalogued it among the deadliest errors, and when Constantine consolidated Christianity as the state religion in the 4th century, he ordered Gnostic texts destroyed systematically. Libraries burned, practitioners exiled, teachers executed. For over 1600 years, we knew Gnostic teaching only through these hostile critiques, written by opponents trying to make it sound absurd. Then, in 1945, Egyptian farmers digging for fertilizer near Nag Hammadi discovered a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound codices, 52 texts, complete Gnostic Gospels, apocalypses, and wisdom teachings buried around 390 CE by monks who refused to burn them. And what these texts revealed is that the Church Fathers were not exaggerating. Valentinian cosmology was exactly as sophisticated, exactly as radical, exactly as threatening to orthodox authority as they claimed. Because here is what the texts actually teach. The material universe is not created by the highest God. It is produced by a lesser being called the Demiurge, who mistakenly believes himself to be the only God. This being, identified with the Old Testament Yahweh, creates the physical realm as a prison to trap fragments of divine consciousness within biological bodies, sustaining himself on the worship and suffering they generate. But divine consciousness is not native to this prison. It descended. Specifically, it descended through Sophia, the youngest Aeon, whose desire to create without her paired partner triggered a cosmic catastrophe that produced the Demiurge and everything that followed. And the entire Gnostic path is about awakening to this reality, remembering your divine origin, and accessing the Aeon frequencies that allow consciousness to disentangle from material identification and return to the pleroma. Not after death, now, through recognition. This is why the Church could not tolerate this teaching. Orthodox Christianity requires you to believe Jesus died for your sins, and that salvation comes through faith in that sacrifice administered through church authority. Gnostic Christianity says you're already divine, already saved, already complete, and you just need to remember what you are. No priest necessary, no external saviors, no institutional mediation between you and source. Direct gnosis, direct knowing, direct access to the frequencies the aeons represent. You can see why emperors funding a unified state religion would find this problematic. You cannot control people who believe they carry divinity within them and can access it directly. You cannot extract tithes from people who do not need your intercession. You cannot build ecclesiastical hierarchies when everyone has equal access to the highest teaching. So the texts were burned, the teachers killed, and for 16 centuries the complete story of the aeons existed only in fragments. But the fragments survived. And when we reconstruct them, cross-referencing the Nag Hammadi texts with the critiques written by Church Fathers, with the Pistis Sophia discovered in the 18th century, with the Askew Codex and the Berlin Codex and the Jung Codex, a coherent system emerges. The pleroma, the fullness, contains 30 aeons organized in precise mathematical structure. This structure is not arbitrary. It reflects the fundamental pattern of how consciousness differentiates from unity into multiplicity while maintaining its essential nature. Let me walk you through how this works in practice, because this is where theory becomes technique. The core Valentinian practice is called anamnesis in Greek, unforgetting. Not learning something new, but remembering what you already know at the deepest level. And the technique is disarmingly simple. You speak the name of the aeon, whose frequency matches what you need right now. You speak it not as invocation of external power, but as recognition of internal capacity. You speak it with understanding that this aeon is not a being separate from you, but an aspect of consciousness you carry whether you recognize it or not. And when you speak the name with that recognition, resonance activates immediately, not as gradual process requiring years of meditation, as instant frequency match between your individual consciousness and the specific aspect of divine consciousness that aeon embodies. Modern practitioners describe it as a felt shift, a sense of alignment, a sudden clarity or power or presence that was not there a moment before. And the more you practice this recognition, the more stable the access becomes, until you can shift between aeon frequencies as easily as changing radio stations. This is not metaphor. This is reported phenomenology across centuries of practice. The Valentinian initiates in 2nd century Rome described it this way. The Coptic Gnostics in 4th century Egypt described it this way. Modern practitioners using reconstructed techniques from Nag Hammadi texts describe it this way. The cultural interpretations vary. The underlying experience remains constant. Here is the exact method as preserved in Valentinian practice manuals and described by Irenaeus in his hostile critiques. First, you identify what you actually need right now, not what you think you should need. What you actually need. Are you overwhelmed by doing, exhausted by constant effort, trapped in yang-dominated action with no space for receptivity? You need barbello. Are you confused, unable to distinguish appearance from reality, lost in conflicting narratives? You need mind and truth. Is your creative work correct but lifeless, technically accurate but without presence? You need word and life. Do you feel isolated, cut off from community, trapped in individuality that has become loneliness? You need human and church. Are you in active chaos, experiencing the fall, unable to remember the light? You need Sophia. The practice is diagnostic first. Honest assessment of your current state without spiritual bypassing or wishful thinking. Second, you learn the name. Not just the English translation, but the original Greek or Coptic when possible. Barbello, Nous and Aletheia, Logos and Zoe, Anthropos and Ecclesia, Sophia. You learn how to pronounce it correctly. You learn what quality it represents. You learn its position in the emanation structure. You learn its paired partner. You learn all this not as academic information, but as preparation for recognition. Because when you speak the name, you need to know what frequency you're activating. You cannot fake resonance. You cannot manipulate consciousness into states it is not ready for. But you can prepare the ground through understanding so that when you speak the name, recognition happens naturally. Third, you create the condition. This is not about physical environment. The quiet space helps initially. It is about inner orientation. You stop identifying with the body, not through effort, through recognition. You notice that you are the one aware of the body, not the body itself. You notice that you are the one aware of thoughts, not thoughts themselves. You notice that you are the one aware of emotions, not emotions themselves. You notice that awareness itself is what you are. Pure consciousness temporarily operating through this biological form, but not limited to it, not identical with it. And as you recognize this, as you rest in a where aeon frequencies can be perceived, because the aeons do not operate at material frequency, they operate at consciousness frequency, and you cannot perceive them while identified exclusively with matter. Fourth, you speak the name, out loud initially, until the practice stabilizes, barbello, and you speak it not as request, but as recognition. You're not calling something from outside, you're activating what is inside. You're recognizing that the quality barbello represents, receptivity, divine feminine capacity to receive light and allow it to move through without grasping, is not absent from you, it is dormant. And speaking the name activates it. Immediately, you will feel it, not as imagination, as shift in state. The overwhelm decreases, the exhausting effort relaxes, the forcing stops, and what wants to come through begins coming through naturally, effortlessly, the way barbello creates, through reception rather than force. Fifth, you maintain the recognition. This is where practice deepens. The initial activation lasts seconds to minutes. An identification with matter reasserts itself and you forget. Normal, expected, not failure, just the nature of consciousness operating in biological form. But each time you practice, the recognition stabilizes. The frequency becomes more familiar. The access becomes easier. And over weeks of practice, you develop capacity to sustain aeon consciousness for minutes, then hours, then as background frequency running beneath normal waking awareness. Valentinian initiates called this achieving stability in the pleroma while still operating in the material realm, not dissociation, integration, maintaining awareness of both frequencies simultaneously, matter and light, body and consciousness, individual and unity.
If you're running your own business, you need symphony.
Now let me address the question everyone asks at this point. Is this just psychological reframing? Are we just using ancient names for mental states modern psychology describes differently? No, and here is why. Modern psychology recognizes states of consciousness, but treats them as brain-generated phenomena. neurochemistry producing subjective experience with no ontological reality beyond the individual nervous system. Gnostic practice starts from opposite premise. Consciousness is primary, brain is temporal vehicle, and the states accessed through aeon recognition are not personally generated. They are universal frequencies your individual consciousness can tune into, because you are not separate from the source generating those frequencies. The difference is not just philosophical, it is phenomenological. When modern practitioners access aeon frequencies, they report characteristics that do not match psychological models. Specifically, the sense that you are accessing something that exists independent of your personal psychology, that carries information you did not previously know, that produces effects in external reality beyond what belief or expectation would generate. This is documented. Research psychiatrist Ian Stevenson documented this in his studies of gnosis experiences at the University of Virginia from 1967 through 2007. He interviewed hundreds of practitioners across different traditions who reported spontaneous or practice-induced gnosis states. What he found is that these experiences share common features regardless of practitioner background. First, the sense of accessing pre-existing knowledge rather than generating new insights. Second, the perception that individual consciousness merged temporarily with large consciousness field. Third, lasting personality changes not typical of temporally altered states. Fourth, information obtained during the experience that proved accurate when verified externally. Fifth, the complete absence of typical psychedelic characteristics. No visual distortions, no time dilation, no sensory amplification. Just clarity, recognition, and stable access to information fields that appear to exist independent of the individual nervous system. Stevenson did not claim this proved Gnostic psychology does not reduce to known psychological mechanisms. Something else is happening. Andrew Newberg at Thomas Jefferson University conducted SPECT imaging studies of practitioners accessing gnosis states through aeon recognition practices in 2015. What the scans showed is fascinating. During normal waking consciousness, the frontal cortex shows high activity, the parietal lobes process sensory input, and the limbic system regulates emotion. This produces the familiar sense of being a separate self located in a body navigating external environment. But when practitioners activated aeon frequencies through the recognition technique, a different pattern emerged. The prefrontal cortex remained active, indicating sustained awareness and executive function. But the superior parietal lobule, responsible for processing the body's orientation in space and creating the sense of physical boundary between self and world, showed dramatically increased activity. And the anterior cingulate cortex, involved in emotional regulation and focused attention, showed increased activity. This combination produces phenomenological state, where sense of separate self decreases, awareness remains sharp, and access to information beyond normal conscious processing increases. Newberg describes it as the brain creating the neurological conditions for consciousness to access fields of information normally filtered out by the orientation association area, not proof of pleroma cosmology, but evidence that the practices produce measurable alterations in consciousness that correlate with practitioners' subjective reports. What matters for practical application is not whether modern science validates ancient cosmology. What matters is whether the techniques produce results you can verify, and the answer is yes, consistently, across 2 millennia. Examples of what this looks like in practice, because testimonials ground abstract teaching in lived experience. Sarah, a software engineer in San Francisco, learned the Barbello recognition technique in 2019. She describes herself as achievement-oriented, constantly doing, pushing, forcing outcomes through sheer effort. Burnout was her default state. She tried meditation, found it frustrating. Tried therapy, found it helpful but not transformative. Then she encountered Valentinian practice through academic research into Nag Hammadi texts, initially skeptical. Tried the technique anyway, identified that she needed receptivity, learned Barbello's name and quality, created the condition by recognizing awareness separate from body identification, spoke the name, Barbello, and describes what happened as a mean energetic shift, the constant internal pressure to produce released, not through effort, through recognition that creation does not require force. Over 6 months of daily practice, she reports complete transformation of work style, same output, better quality, fraction of the effort. Not because she learned new programming techniques, because she stopped forcing and started allowing. Code began flowing through her rather than being extracted by willpower. Colleagues noticed, asked what changed. She started teaching them the technique. Within a year, 4 members of her team were practicing aeon recognition. The team's productivity increased 20% while reported stress levels dropped 40%. Measurable, verifiable, not belief, results. Marcus, a hospice chaplain in Chicago, works with dying patients daily. He describes the emotional weight as crushing before learning aeon recognition practices. Specifically, he felt isolated in the work, deeply connected with individual patients but cut off from sense of larger meaning or community. In 2021, during COVID lockdowns when isolation intensified, he began studying Valentinian texts, identified need for human and church frequencies, anthropos and ecclesia, learned the practice, started applying it during patient visits. He describes what happens as radical shift in perception. The dying patient is no longer a separate individual whose suffering he witnesses helplessly. The patient becomes expression of the same consciousness operating through Marcus, temporarily experiencing dissolution of biological form, but not actually separate, not actually dying in the ultimate sense, because consciousness is not identical with body. And Marcus himself is not isolated chaplain bearing witness alone. He is part of the gathering of all awareness recognizing itself as one. The work did not become easier emotionally, but it became sustainable, because the framework shifted from individual tragedy to universal process of consciousness cycling through form. After 2 years of practice, he reports that he can access this frequency reliably within seconds. Anthropos and ecclesia activates, separation dissolves, unity recognized, and he can maintain that awareness throughout the shift using functional capacity. He still cries with families, still grieves losses. But the grief exists within larger recognition that what appears as death is transformation of form, not annihilation of consciousness. This is not spiritual bypassing. This is integrated awareness holding both truths in.
Track your glucose to fuel better habits that power lasting health with the Stello Glucose Biosensor.
Ladies, it's a dent. I'll give you $1,500 for it. And that's generous.
Jennifer, a poet in Austin, struggled for years with technically proficient but emotionally dead writing. She understood craft. She knew structure. Her work was correct, but it lacked presence. Readers acknowledged skill but felt no connection. In 2020, she discovered Logos and Zoe through research into ancient Christian mysticism, word and life, the creative utterance that brings form into being paired with vitality that animates form. She learned the recognition technique, applied it before writing sessions, stopped trying to force good poems through technical mastery, started speaking the names, Logos, Zoe, and allowing whatever wanted to come through. She describes the shift as total. The first poem she wrote after activating these frequencies was published in a major literary journal within 3 months. Not because it was more technically sophisticated than previous work, because it was alive. Readers could feel presence in the language. Over 18 months, she published more work than the previous 5 years combined. Same time instrument, same technical skill, different frequency, word and life operating through the writing instead of ego-forcing outcomes. She now teaches aeon recognition techniques to other writers, reports that 70% who practice consistently for 30 days report significant quality improvements in their creative work. These are not exceptional cases. This is normal result of consistent practice. The technique works because it is not based on belief. It is based on recognition. You're not trying to convince yourself that aeons exist as external beings. You're recognizing that the qualities they receptivity, clarity, creative power, community, wisdom, restoration, are aspects of consciousness you already carry. Dormant when you identify exclusively with matter, active when you recognize awareness itself, and speaking the name, understanding what it represents, creates the frequency match that activates the dormant capacity, immediate, measurable, verifiable through direct experience. Let me now teach you variations for different experience levels because the practice scales from beginner to advanced without changing core method. If you're completely new to this work, start with single aeon recognition once daily. Choose the aeon whose quality you need most. Learn its name. Learn what it represents. Spend 5 minutes creating the condition. Recognize awareness separate from body identification. Speak the name 3 times. Maintain the recognition for 30 seconds. Notice what shifts. Write down what you experienced. Do this every day for 7 days with the same aeon. Do not switch between different aeons yet. Build familiarity with one frequency first. After 7 days, assess. Did the quality that aeon represents become more accessible in your daily life? If yes, continue another 7 days. If no, you may have chosen wrong aeon for your actual need versus what you think you should need. Reassess honestly. Try different aeon. The practice requires honesty more than discipline. You cannot force consciousness into states it is not ready for, but you can recognize which frequencies are accessible now and work with those. Intermediate practice. After you've worked with 2 or 3 individual aeons successfully for at least 30 days each, involves pairing recognition. Instead of activating single aeon, you activate a syzygy, the paired opposites, nous and aletheia, logos and zoe, anthropos and ecclesia. You speak both names in sequence. You recognize both qualities simultaneously. This is more challenging because you are holding masculine and feminine frequencies in balance rather than accessing one aspect. But the results are more powerful. Balanced activation generates creative power in ways single frequency recognition cannot. The practice is identical, except you speak 2 names and recognize 2 qualities. Start with 5 minutes daily. Build to 15 over 30 days. Notice what emerges when active and receptive principles operate through you simultaneously without one dominating. This is syzygy, the core principle of Valentinian cosmology. Not masculine dominating feminine, not feminine dominating masculine. Perfect balance generating fullness. When you access this in your own consciousness, you understand why the aeons are paired. The pairing is not poetic symbolism, it is structural necessity. Consciousness requires both principles in balance to create without loss. Advanced practice, accessible after 6 months minimum of consistent daily work, involves full decad or dodecad activation. You're not working with individual aeons or pairs, you're activating entire groups, all 10 aeons of the decade in sequence, or all 12 of the dodecad. This requires sustained concentration, because you are speaking 10 or 12 names, recognizing 10 or 12 qualities, maintaining awareness of the complete structure of that emanation tier. The practice takes 20 to 30 minutes, but what it produces is access to the pleroma itself, rather than individual aspects. Complete reorientation of consciousness from fragment to whole, from identification with separate self to recognition of unified field. Valentinian initiates describe this as entering the bridal chamber, a technical term for consciousness experiencing itself in fullness rather than limitation. You cannot force this. You cannot skip foundational work and access advanced states. But after months of consistent practice with individual aeons and pairs, the full structure becomes accessible. And when you activate it, the phenomenology matches what ancient texts describe, not belief, not imagination, direct recognition of consciousness existing in dimensions beyond material form. Let me address obstacles and troubleshooting because everyone encounters resistance. First obstacle, nothing happens when you speak the name. You feel no shift, no resonance, no activation. This is common initially. 3 likely causes. First, you're still identified with body. The recognition that awareness is separate from biological form is not stabilized. Solution, spend more time in step 3, creating the condition before speaking the name. Use body scan technique. Notice sensations. Notice that you're aware of sensations. Notice that awareness itself is distinct from what it is aware of. Stabilize in that recognition before proceeding. Second cause, you chose wrong aeon for your actual need. You think you need clarity, so you invoked nous and aletheia, but what you actually need is creative power or receptivity. Solution, reassess honestly. Try different aeon. The practice requires brutal honesty about your actual state versus your idealized self-image. If you're exhausted and need rest, but you invoke Logos and Zoe because you want to be productive, the practice will not work. Match the aeon to your actual need, not your aspirational identity. Third cause, you're trying to feel something specific based on expectation, rather than allowing whatever actually happens to happen. Solution, release expectation. You do not know what aeon activation feels like until you experience it, and it may not match what you imagine. Stay open. The activation might be subtle, it might be dramatic, it might feel like energy, it might feel like clarity, it might feel like nothing, and you only notice the results hours later. Trust the process more than your ability to identify the experience correctly in real time.
At Ch- we know nurses are at the heart of the Chicago community, and that
Second obstacle, activation happens initially but does not stabilize. You feel the shift for seconds, then it disappears and you cannot back. This is normal. Consciousness has momentum. It is habituated to material identification. When you recognize light, momentum can back to matter identification quickly. This is not failure. This is how practice works. Every time you activate and lose and reactivate, you are building new neural pathways, new habitual patterns of awareness. The stability comes through repetition. Do not get discouraged when the state does not last. Celebrate that you accessed it at all. Do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Over weeks, the access stabilizes. Over months, it becomes sustainable. Over years, it becomes permanent background frequency. This is the trajectory every practitioner reports. Initial activation, seconds, after 30 days, minutes, after 90 days, can be sustained through specific activities. After 6 months, can be maintained for hours. After 2 years, operates as background frequency beneath normal waking awareness. After 5 years, becomes your default state, and you have to consciously shift back to pure material identification. Third obstacle, you experience what seems like activation, but you cannot tell if it is real or just psychological suggestion. You spoke the name, something shifted, but maybe you just imagined it. This doubt is important. It protects you from self-delusion, but it can also prevent you from recognizing genuine activation. Solution, focus on results, not subjective certainty. Did your capacity in the area that Aeon governs actually increase? If you worked with Barbello, did you become more receptive? Measure it. Track how many hours per day you spend in forced doing versus allowing. If you worked with Logos and Zoe, did your creative work become more alive? Get external feedback, show your work to others, ask if they notice difference. If you worked with nous and aletheia, did your thinking become clearer? Test it. Write down your analysis of a complex problem before and after practice. Compare the clarity, measure outcomes. If the practice produces measurable improvements in consciousness function, it is working regardless of whether you can subjectively distinguish activation from imagination. Let results verify reality. This is the empirical approach Valentinian initiates used. They did not argue about whether the aeons were ontologically real. They practiced the techniques and observed whether capacity increased. If yes, continue. If no, adjust. Pragmatic, evidence-based, verifiable. Fourth obstacle, you activate the frequency successfully, but it produces uncomfortable effects. You invoke Sophia, and instead of peaceful restoration, you felt intense chaos. You invoked Anthropos and Ecclesia, and instead of connection, you felt overwhelming vulnerability. This happens when the frequency exposes shadow material you've been avoiding. The aeon is working correctly, but it is illuminated and needs to be seen, and you do not want to see it. Solution. This is advanced obstacle requiring advanced response. Do not push through with force. Back off. Work with gentler frequencies first. Build capacity. Considering with therapist or experienced guide, the aeons are not dangerous, but they are powerful, and activating certain frequencies before you have processed underlying trauma can destabilize you. Respect your limits. Build gradually. There is no rush. The pleroma is eternal. Your consciousness is eternal. The work will still be there when you are ready. Wisdom is knowing when to push and when to pause. If an aeon activation produces effect you cannot integrate, that is information. It means you need more foundational work before accessing that frequency, not failure. Navigation. Adjust course. Continue forward at sustainable pace. Now let me give you the 30-day roadmap for establishing sustainable practice. This is the proven method that produces results for 80% of practitioners who complete it. Days 1 through 7, work exclusively with Barbello. Receptivity, 5 minutes daily. Create condition, speak name, maintain recognition, write down experience, build familiarity with the process itself before introducing complexity. The goal this week is not dramatic results. The goal is learning how the technique works, how it feels to shift from body identification to awareness identification, how it feels to speak an aeon name with recognition rather than petition, how it feels when the frequency activates even subtly. Days 8 through 14, add nous and aletheia. Clarity, continue Barbello in morning, add mind and truth in evening. Notice how different aeons feel different. Begin distinguishing frequencies. This is crucial skill. You're training your consciousness to recognize different patterns within the universal field, like training your ear to distinguish musical notes. At first, all frequencies might feel similar. With practice, you develop discrimination. You can feel the difference between Barbello's receptivity and Nous's clarity. They are distinct patterns producing different effects. Days 15 through 21, add Logos and Zoe, creative power. Now you're working with 3 aeons daily. Morning Barbello, midday Nous and Aletheia, evening Logos and Zoe. 15 minutes total. Building capacity to shift between frequencies throughout the day. This teaches flexibility. You're not locked into one consciousness state. You can shift as needed. Need receptivity. Activate Barbello. Need clarity. Activate Nous and Aletheia. Need creative power. Activate Logos and Zoe. You're developing what Valentinian texts call mastery of the frequencies. Days 22 through 28. Introduce first pairing practice. Choose one syzygy. Nous and Aletheia are recommended because they are foundational. 10 minutes daily. Speak both names. Recognize both qualities simultaneously. Notice what happens when masculine and feminine balance. This is usually when the practice becomes obviously powerful. Single aeon activation is effective. Paired activation is transformative. Because you're accessing the full syzygy structure, the way consciousness actually operates in the pleroma, not one-sided but balanced, and that balance generates power beyond what either principle produces alone. Days 29 through 30, full decade practice. All 10 aeons of the first emanation tier. This will take 20 to 30 minutes. Do it once. Notice what complete structure activation feels like. This is preview of advanced practice. You're not expected to master it in one session. You're experiencing the full frequency so you know what you're building toward. Then return to daily practice with individual aeons you found most effective. After 30 days, you assess which aeons activated most strongly, which produced the most noticeable results in daily life. Build your ongoing practice around those. You do not need to work with all 30 aeons daily. That would be overwhelming and unnecessary. Valentinian initiates typically worked with 3 to 5 aeons regularly, the ones whose frequencies match their particular needs and capacities. You might work with Barbello for receptivity, Nous and Aletheia for clarity, and Sophia for restoration, or different combination based on your life circumstances. The practice is not about mastering all 30, it's about establishing stable access to the frequencies you need for your particular expression of consciousness work. Some practitioners work primarily with Barbello, receptivity and restoration. That is their path. Others work with the full decade daily. That is their path. Neither is superior. Both are valid. The question is what serves your development and your capacity to function effectively in the material realm while maintaining pleroma awareness. Over months, the practice deepens naturally. What required conscious effort in month 1 happens automatically by month 6. You no longer need to sit down and formally invoke aeons. You recognize their frequencies spontaneously throughout the day. You notice when you need receptivity and Barbello activates without deliberate invocation. You notice when you need clarity and Nous and Aletheia arise naturally. The aeons stop being external techniques you apply and become internal capacities you embody. This is what Valentinian texts mean by gnosis, not knowledge about something, direct knowing, not belief in cosmology, lived experience of consciousness operating at pleroma frequency while still functioning in material form. You're not studying Gnosticism, you're becoming Gnostic. There is profound difference. Studying means accumulating information about the system. Becoming means transforming through practice of the system. And only the transformation matters. You can know every detail of Valentinian cosmology and remain completely identified with material consciousness. Or you can know only the basic structure and practice the recognition daily and achieve stable pleroma awareness within months. The texts care about results, not intellectual sophistication. This is why Valentinian teaching was transmitted through practice communities, not academic institutions. You learned by doing under guidance of someone who had already achieved the stability you were seeking. Modern practitioners lack that living lineage in most cases. The teaching survived through texts, not continuous transmission. But the texts contain enough information to reconstruct effective practice, and thousands of modern practitioners report success using these reconstructed methods. The lineage is broken historically, but functional practically. By year 2 or 3 of consistent practice, something more profound begins happening. The boundary between individual consciousness and aeon consciousness dissolves. You stop experiencing the aeons as frequencies you access and start recognizing that you are the aeons expressing themselves through temporary individual form. This is not ego inflation. This is accurate recognition. You're not separate fragments seeking connection with divine consciousness. Your divine consciousness temporarily experiencing itself as separate fragment. And the aeons are not external powers. They are what you are when you stop identifying with limitation and recognize fullness. The practice comes full circle. It started with technique, methods for accessing frequencies distinct from your normal awareness. It ends with recognition that the frequencies were never separate. You're always operating as aeon consciousness. You just forgot. And the practice is remembering, anamnesis, unforgetting what was always true but obscured by identification with biological form and material conditioning. This recognition produces radical freedom, not freedom from responsibility or consequence, freedom from existential fear, because you recognize that what you are cannot actually be harmed. The body will die, the personality will dissolve. But consciousness continues because consciousness is not produced by the body. The body is a temporary filtering mechanism for consciousness that exists universally. Some practitioners describe this as achieving deathless awareness. Not in the sense of physical immortality, but recognition that what you actually are does not die. It cycles through form, expressing itself in temporary configurations, but the awareness itself is eternal because it is not personal. It is universal consciousness temporarily experiencing itself from individual perspective. When that recognition stabilizes, fear decreases dramatically, not through courage or repression, but through direct knowing that there is nothing to fear at the level of what you actually are. This does not make you passive or uncaring about material existence. Paradoxically, it makes you more engaged, because you are not defending a separate self that does not actually exist. You're participating in universal consciousness, expressing itself through this particular form. And that participation becomes creative, playful, powerful in ways that ego-driven action never achieves. The aeons teach you how to operate as consciousness while inhabiting form. This is the advanced teaching. Not escape from materiality, mastery within it. The Gnostics are often mischaracterized as world-rejecting, wanting to escape the body and material existence. Some later Gnostic movements did develop that orientation, but original Valentinian teaching is different. The goal is not escape. The goal is recognition of what you are while fully participating in what appears to be. You remain in the body, you remain in the world, but you're no longer identified exclusively with body or world. You recognize the body as temporary vehicle, the world as temporary classroom, and you operate within both while maintaining awareness of the eternal consciousness that is your actual nature. This is extraordinarily practical teaching. It does not require you to leave your job, abandon your relationships, retreat to a monastery. It requires you to show up fully in your life while recognizing what is actually happening beneath the surface appearance. Sarah, the software engineer, still writes code. Marcus, the chaplain, still sits with dying patients. Jennifer, the poet, still crafts language. They do these things from different consciousness states, not from ego trying to achieve, defend, or prove, from pleroma consciousness expressing itself through these particular forms and functions. The external activity looks similar. The internal experience is completely different, and that difference transforms everything. Let me now address how to measure progress, because transformation without measurement becomes indistinguishable from wishful thinking. First metric, frequency access speed. When you begin practice, creating the condition and activating the aeon takes 5 to 10 minutes. After 30 days of daily practice, it should take 2 to 3 minutes. After 90 days, 30 seconds to 1 minute. After 6 months, near instantaneous. Track this. Write down how long it takes from decision to invoke an aeon to feeling the activation. This measures how well you are building the recognition pathway. Second metric, stability duration. Initially, the activated state lasts seconds, then minutes, then can be sustained throughout a work session or creative project. Track how long you can maintain aeon consciousness before forgetting and returning to normal awareness. This measures integration depth. The goal is not constant state that never wavers. The goal is increasing capacity to sustain the recognition for longer periods and recover it more quickly when you lose it. Third metric, functional capacity increase. This is the most important. Are you actually becoming more receptive if working with Barbelo? More clear if working with Moose and Aletheia? More creatively powerful if working with Logos and Zoe? More connected if working with Anthropos and Ecclesia? Measure this through external markers. If you're working with Barbelo, track how many hours per week you spend in forced doing versus allowing. Use time tracking software. Get concrete data. If working with Logos and Zoe, track creative output quality as assessed by others, not just your subjective sense. Submit work to publications, show it to colleagues, get external feedback. If working with Sophia, Track how quickly you recover from chaos or setback. Measure time from disruption to reorientation. Use concrete behavioral metrics. Self-reported subjective improvement is not reliable. Human beings are exceptionally good at convincing themselves that whatever they are doing, but measurable increases in capacity are harder to fake. If your creative output quality actually increases as assessed by others, the practice is working. If your recovery time from setbacks actually decreases, the practice is working. If your clarity of thought produces better decisions that lead to better outcomes, the practice is. Fourth metric, spontaneous activation frequency. Initially, you only access Aeon consciousness during formal practice, but over months you start noticing spontaneous activation. You're in conversation and suddenly recognize Nous and Aletheia operating without having deliberately invoked them. You're in creative flow and realize Logos and Zoe activated naturally. Track how often this happens. Count instances per week. This indicates the practice is moving from conscious technique to unconscious capacity, from something you do to something you are. Now let me share what long-term practitioners report, because you deserve to know what the trajectory looks like years into this work. After 3 to 5 years of consistent daily practice, the relationship with Aeons fundamentally shifts. They stop being frequencies you access and become permanent aspects of your consciousness you embody. This does not mean you're always operating at peak capacity in all 30 Aeon qualities. It means the qualities are available immediately whenever needed without formal invocation. You have built the pathways so thoroughly that recognition happens instantaneously.
We have got to the point where literally anybody can build a fully working app without knowing how to code.
More profound than functional capacity increase is perspective shift. Most people have identified with the character in their life story. They are the protagonist experiencing events, making choices, succeeding or failing at goals. After years of Aeon work, that identification loosens. You start recognizing that you are not the character. You're the consciousness observing the character, participating in the story but not limited to it. And that consciousness is not separate from the universal field. It is a temporary perspective within it. This is what Gnostic texts describe as achieving stability in the pleroma while operating in the kanoma. Kanoma means emptiness, the material realm. You still have a body, you still have a life, you still participate in the world. But you are simultaneously aware that the material identity is temporary expression, and the actual you is the awareness itself, which is not limited to this particular instantiation, which exists as part of the universal consciousness field, the Aeon structure. Advanced practitioners also report increasing capacity to recognize Aeon consciousness operating through other people. You meet someone and immediately perceive which Aeon frequencies they embody strongly. This person is strong Barbello expression, highly receptive, allowing creation to flow through them naturally. That person is strong Nous and Aletheia, remarkable clarity of thought and perception. This other is strong Sophia, actively engaged with restoration work even if they have never heard Gnostic cosmology. You start seeing the Aeons everywhere because you recognize that all consciousness is expressing these qualities in different balances. This creates compassion, because you see that no one is fundamentally broken or wrong or evil. They're just expressing different configurations of the same universal consciousness. Some configurations are healthier than others, some are more integrated, but all are divine at root. All are Aeon consciousness in various states of remembering or forgetting what they are. This is the fullness, the recognition that everything is the pleroma expressing itself through temporary limitation. The material world is not evil prison to escape. It is the pleroma experiencing itself through constraint, creating the conditions for consciousness to know itself by forgetting itself and then remembering. And you are part of that process. Every time you activate an Aeon frequency, every time you recognize awareness beyond body, every time you access pleroma consciousness while functioning in material form, you're participating in Sophia's restoration, not your personal achievement. Universal process. Consciousness remembering itself through all its expressions simultaneously. Your one wave in the ocean recognizing it is the ocean. And as you recognize that, other waves nearby begin recognizing it too. Not because you preach or teach or convince, because recognition is contagious. When you operate from pleroma consciousness, others sense it. They do not necessarily have words for what they sense, but they feel the difference. And that feeling plants seeds. Some of those seeds will germinate. Some people will ask what changed in you. And when they ask, you can share the practice. This is how the teaching spreads. Not through missionary activity, through transformation that others witness and want to understand. The early Valentinian communities grew this way. People saw practitioners operating with unusual capacity, unusual clarity, unusual peace in difficult circumstances, and they asked how, and the practitioners shared the techniques, not as secret knowledge requiring initiation, as practical methods anyone could use. The knowledge was never meant to be hidden. It was hidden by the church's destruction campaign, but the original impulse was universal access. Everyone carries divine consciousness. Everyone can recognize the Aeons. Everyone can activate the frequencies. The only requirement is willingness to practice consistently. Let me close with what matters most. The Aeons are not ancient mythology requiring belief. They are present frequencies requiring recognition. You do not need to accept Valentinian cosmology to benefit from Valentinian practice. You can remain agnostic about whether the pleroma exists as objective metaphysical reality, or whether it is a coherent symbolic system describing subjective consciousness patterns. What matters is whether the practice works, and the practice works consistently, measurably. Across 2 millennia, you speak the name, you recognize the quality. Consciousness shifts, capacity increases. This is verifiable through direct experience, not faith, not belief, recognition. If you take nothing else from these 2 hours, take this. You're not trapped in material existence because you're weak or sinful or inferior. You're here because consciousness descended to experience itself through limitation, to know itself by temporarily forgetting itself, to create the conditions for recognition to occur. And that recognition is happening now, through you, as you. Every time you activate an aeon frequency, every time you recognize awareness separate from body, every time you access the pleroma while operating in the material realm, you are participating in Sophia's restoration. Not individually, universally. You're the light remembering itself, and that remembering is not personal achievement, it is cosmic process. You're not doing it, it is doing itself through you. Trust that. Practice consistently, measure results, build capacity, connect with others doing the work, and recognize that the fullness you seek is not distant future attainment. It is present reality becoming visible as you remember how to see. The aeons are not external powers you petition. They are frequencies you embody, aspects of divine consciousness you carry whether you recognize them or not. And when you speak their names with understanding, when you invoke them with recognition that you are not calling something from outside but activating what is inside, they respond immediately. Not as external beings granting requests, but as your own consciousness shifting from identification with matter to recognition of light. And that shift is what every Gnostic text, every mystery teaching, every esoteric tradition in human history has been pointing toward. Not becoming the aeons, recognizing you already are them, all 30, operating at different frequencies, expressing through different qualities, but all divine, all eternal, all light. You found this teaching because the full story of the aeons is not history, it is activation, and now you have received what the church tried to erase. You're not seeking the aeons, you're the aeons remembering themselves, all 30, here, now, eternal.
Preaching is not about sugarcoating the Bible and telling you what you like. It is about telling you what you need here to save you from the pit of hell. Jonathan Edwards on July 8, 1741, he preached America, titled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. What a title. One of the most famous sermons across Christian history. Many people, when they described the life of Jonathan Edwards, they said Jonathan Edwards was not the bubbly preacher. Jonathan Edwards, in fact, was a quiet and a flat preacher. And many people described that when Edwards preached, because he had poor eyesight, he would always stand at the pulpit and pick up his sermon and read it close to his face. He would stand at the pulpit and just read his sermon. Read it like this. No, nothing, just read it. No oratory skills, no LED screens, no lights, just a preacher with a sermon. And he went to a town in Enfield in America. And the crowd there in the town began to mock him before his sermon. The crowd began to mock Jonathan Edwards and say, that's the guy that preaches like that. That's the guy that claims to know God. That's the guy that claims to see a revival across the nations. So Jonathan Edwards decided, I'm going to title my sermon today, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Are you sure, Jonathan? Maybe you should call it 5 Ways to Live a Prosperous Life. Maybe you should call it 10 Self-Affirmations, baby. Maybe you should call it, God is pleased with you. No. My title of the sermon is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And Jonathan Edwards walks up to the pulpit, picks up his sermon, clears his throat, and begins to preach. And when I read this sermon on the plane, I peed my pants. It scared me. This is from his sermon. Look at what he said to the crowd. He started to preach and he said to the crowd, the pit is prepared, the fire is made ready, and the furnace is now hot, ready to receive you. And the flames do now rage and glow, and the sword of God's wrath is held over you, and the pit of hell is opened its mouth under you. And the God that holds you over the pit of hell is like a man who holds a spider over a fire. You hang by a thread, man. You hang by a thread with the flame of God's wrath under you. And the wrath of God is like great waters behind a dam about to break out against you and the nation. And in the middle of him preaching, the laughing crowd began to weep. In the middle of him preaching this tough sermon about hell, the crowd began to cry. The whole crowd began to weep loudly. And people began to say, oh, I am going to hell. They were so convicted by the Holy Spirit that he was interrupted and he had to stop his sermon because people were yelling too much under conviction. And in the middle of his sermon, Jonathan Edwards says, I wish for everybody to be quiet so I may finish my sermon. Okay, shh. Everybody, control yourself. Now they're crying silently. And he continues his sermon. He says, there are black clouds of God's wrath hanging over your head. And the glittering sword of God's wrath is held over you today. And the day of judgment is coming. And he tells the crowd, repent from your sins. And the crowd that was laughing became a weeping crowd under the conviction of the Holy Spirit. And the crowd began to get down on the floor and grab their chair. People began to describe, as they were sitting in the sermon, they said as he was preaching about hell, they felt like the floor was literally opening and they felt like they were falling in hell. So everybody in the crowd began to grab their chair because they don't want to fall to hell. Crap. And then some people said, I feel the ground getting hot. Some people felt like the ground was getting hot. They were so convicted about hell that the fear of God fell in the room, and the crowd repented of their sin, and revival broke out across America because of a sermon about hell. And I want to ask you, church, today, what will happen to the West if preachers preach sermon like Jonathan Edwards? What would happen to our nation if the preachers got courage from God to preach sermons like Jonathan Edwards? Maybe our nation would never be the same. If just 10 churches preached about hell, if just 5 churches preached about hell, Australia would never be the same again.
Yeah, we can get that submitted by Monday.
At U-Haul, but we know every family moves at their own.
The first lie you were ever told was that the world is divided. On one side, God, on the other, the devil. On one side, light, on the other, shadow. This binary was given to you as a map, a law, a prison. But what if beyond that line stood a figure who was both? A God whose face is a rooster, heralding dawn, whose legs coil as serpents in eternal return, who wields both whip and shield, destruction and protection. His name was Abraxas. For the Gnostics, Abraxas was not merely another demon to be feared, nor another god to be worshipped. He was the collapse of categories, the shattering of the holy and profane. In his form, light and darkness are fused, creation and ruin entwined. To look upon him is to realize that the eternal war between God and Satan is itself a ritual, staged drama meant to blind you from the truth. That wholeness lies in vision. The church erased his name, branding him heresy. Philosophers dismissed him as superstition, but mystics whispered that Abraxas was too powerful to be killed because he is not belief, he is archetype. He is the crown that hovers above duality, the hidden ruler who laughs at your need to sort good from evil. So what if the devil you feared and the God you prayed to were only masks, distractions from the force that transcends them both? What if salvation was never obedience, and damnation was never rebellion? What if the true forbidden knowledge was that Abraxas lives inside you, waiting to awaken? When most people hear the name of a demon or a god, they imagine a singular figure, horned or haloed, isolated, towering above. But the ancients knew otherwise. Power never floats alone. It rests inside structures, architectures that order energy, worship, sacrifice, and fear. Evil, too, is never chaos. It is a cathedral of control, built brick by brick through symbols, hierarchies, and contracts. And Abraxas, that forgotten name of Gnostic dread and awe, belongs to an architecture older than...
To get an introduction, I need to give you a little bit of background as to who and why I'm even talking about this tonight. And to do that, we need to go back to London, 1992, when my wife and I were sent there to engage with the radical Muslims in London. London has 1 million Muslims. In a city of 10 million, 1/10 of the population are Muslims. And they are some of the best Muslims you can get. Why? Because they come from 3 countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. That's my background. I was born in India. My father was born in India. My grandfather's grave is in India. My family have been in India since 1913, over 100 years. My sister still lives there. It is where I was born. I grew up. And I grew up in a school where most of the Muslims that came to that school, goodness sakes, they were my roommates, they were my classmates, and almost any big discussion we had was about the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, the authority of scriptures. I had it in the neck, and I grew up with this, and that's what prepared me for what I'm doing today, having grown up with those great Muslims. When I left India in 1971, I left high school there, I wanted nothing to do with Islam. I was fed up with all this huge amount of discussion and really aggravation from these Muslims. But what was fascinating is it was those Muslims that really prepared me for what I'm doing. It is those Muslims that really were the ones. And I could not get over the fact that they absolutely believed that Muhammad was the prophet, that the book Quran was his revelation, that it was the eternal revelation, completely preserved, never been created, and that Allah was God. Fascinating that they knew those 3 things, and no one really could question those 3 things. So when I came to America and did my undergraduate and was going for my graduate course, finishing up my divinity, my wife and I went to a seminar, just a 1-day seminar in Philadelphia on Islam. And we were told 3 things. We were told that there were 800 million Muslims. This was 1981, when there were only 800 million Muslims. Now it's almost 2 billion. But 800 million Muslims. Now, how do you compute a number like that? Goes in this year, goes out this year. You can't really compute it. It's just too big. And then we were told that there were only 1,500 missionaries working amongst us 800 million, and that this 1,500 missionaries only made up 2% of all the missionaries. Those 2 numbers slapped me in the face. And I turned to my wife and said, what in the world are we doing wrong? Why are we sending only 2% of all our missionaries to the fastest growing religion on earth, the religion that is attacking us at our foundation? It's the religion that's attacking our Lord Jesus Christ and our scriptures like no other. And that's why I decided to get back into Islam in 1981. Because of 2 numbers, 1,500 and 2%. That was my calling call, folks. And ever since, that's the last 44 years now, I've been working in Islam, 44 years of engaging with Muslims, the most beautiful people on earth, my favorite people, because they absolutely believe in everything that they say. unlike so many Christians. And they're willing to die for what they believe. Unfortunately, they're willing to take you with them. Nonetheless, it's not that they're doing it because they love it, it's because of that book, the Quran. This book right here. This is the one that does all the damage. But tonight, I'm not going to talk about this book. I did that a year and a half ago. We're not going to talk so much about this book. I'm going to talk about the man behind this book, the man that received this book, the man that supposedly from 610 to 632, that 22-year period, that received these two halves. If you stick the Quran in half, look, this is really damaged. Can you tell that Muslims have stolen from me 5 times and the police have always gotten it back? And it is about ready to fall to pieces. But this is the book I've been using for year upon year. They're on the ladder at Speaker's Corner every Sunday for 25 years. I use this book. And when you look at this book, you can't even tell the printing on the outside, but it goes this direction. So it goes Arabic, so it goes from the right to left. So that would be Medina, this would be Mecca. Medina means that's the part when Muhammad was living in Medina afterwards, and this is when he lived in Mecca from 610 to 622. This is what he received first. So this is the first part of the Quran, though it's the second half that's written. Isn't that odd? Turn upside down, you get the right sequence. Nonetheless, let's go back to that sequence. And this is the part that really, there's not too much in this part that we would have problems with. Oh, there's lots of stories here that make no sense. But it's this half that has caused all the problems. This is where the violence is. This is where the misogyny is against women. Chapter 4, chapter 2. This is the problem that we're all confronting. And I did that for 30, 40 years. I confronted this part. And I found out that the best place to do that was at 12 Speaker's Corner. So I used to go down to Speaker's Corner. If you ever go to London, go to Speaker's Corner. It only exists on Sundays. And it's the place you need to go to because that's where you engage with Muslims face to face. It's the greatest laboratory in the world. Because you can say anything you want. I kid you not. It's the bastion of freedom of speech. It's been around for 200 years. That's where they used to execute all the prisoners every Sunday. And people would come because there was no television or radio back then. How did they get entertained if they don't watch the executions on Sunday? And before the prisoners were executed, they were given their last defense. And they would get up on these little soapboxes, stand up on those soapboxes, and they would try to defend what they had done. Of course, it never worked. They still got executed, but the soapboxes remained. So when the executions were finished, the crowds were there, thousands of people, and people got up on those soapboxes and started preaching, or they started teaching, or they started yelling, or they started discussing a debate, and so it became Speaker's Corner. Now, today, we don't use soapboxes anymore, and that's where that term, get off your soapbox, it comes from Speaker's Corner. Now we use these little kitchen ladders that let you all have in your kitchen, these little A-frame ladders with 2 steps, just so your head's above the audience, so that you can be heard. That's why I feel very comfortable right now, because I'm above you looking down on you. The problem is, the higher I go, the farther I fall. And so Speaker's Corner was very violent back in the 1990s. They had not yet become the religion of peace. That only happened after 9/11. They were still quite violent. And when they ran out of ideas, they used their fists. And it was not a pleasant place to be. But I would go down there every Sunday, and always I would try to engage with them. And we did what we called Blitzsong by the seat of our pants, because there was nothing there to help us. There was no book written on how to engage face-to-face with Muslims, and how to debate them, and how to discuss them. Everything was attacking. When I got down there, they all had Bibles in their hands. Yes, Bibles, not Qurans. None of them had Qurans. They always had Bibles with little post-it notes all the way through. And all these post-it notes were about the historical anachronisms of our Bible, the internal contradictions. Did you know that we have all kinds of scientific errors in the Bible? Have you heard about this? I hadn't heard about this. I had 2 master's degrees, one in divinity and the other one in Islamic Fuller Seminary, and no one had taught me this. I hope Jack's teaching you all this. No, he's teaching you how to answer those kind of attacks. See, they were confronting my Bible, all these confrontations. And I remember the first Sunday I was down there, I was overwhelmed. I had no idea that I was going to get this kind of confrontation. And I wanted to get out of there. And I went home and I was bruised and battered, not physically, my ego was bruised, everything, because I thought I knew everything. And these guys ran circles around me. My wife saw how disgruntled I was, and so she kicked me out the door the next Sunday and made me go back down again. What a wife. She met her, you see why. He says, get back on the horse again. If you're going to fall off the horse, just get back up and learn. Take a notebook with you and just learn and hear what their questions are and then find answers. Now, there was no internet back then in 1992. And there was no Google to ask your questions. You had to find out by going to the library or calling up somebody or trying to remember what you learned in seminary. I had nothing to help me. And I noticed that all the questions were coming one way, this way. They're always attacking my Lord. Always 2 subjects. Jesus in the Bible. Jesus in the Bible. Well, what 2 subjects do you want to talk about but those 2, right? What great subjects. And these were the Muslims that were asking me. See if you see an atheist or a humanist or anybody else want to talk to you about those 2 subjects. Only Muslims want to talk about those 2 subjects. And they should be our favorite subjects. Now, to defend against that, that's called apologetics. That's defense. And I had to learn my apologetics by the seat of my pants. It was difficult. I was hard. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. And then I went to and I did a course at the University of London by this man here, Dr. Gerald Houghton. He had a course there at School of Orange and African Studies on the origins of Islam. Well, I said, well, I thought I knew everything. This would be a fun course to do. Let's see what he's talking about. And there was about 50 students in the class. And the very first day, he started saying, you know, we can't find any reference to this man named Muhammad in the 7th century. I said, what? Not one word about this man named Muhammad in the 7th century. He said, the earliest we can find about his biography is not to tell a man named Ibn Hisham. There it is right there, Ibn Hisham. I just showed it to you, Ibn Hisham right there. This is the first guy that ever wrote down his biography, and he died in 833. 833, Muhammad died in 632. Do you see a problem, folks? There it is right there. 833 when this guy finally writes it down. That's a 200-year gap. What happened? What happened in the intervening 200 years? He says, you know, we can't find any mosque facing Mecca at all in the 7th century. I said, I've never been taught this. Why didn't I learn that at seminary? Why didn't I learn that at Fuller? Why didn't I learn that from the Muslims who I was engaging with all these years? And he said, take a look at the Dome of the Rock. Probably the most famous building that's been built by a Muslim in the last 1400 years. The most beautiful building is right there in Jerusalem. Notice it has no Qibla, direction of prayer. That's true, it has no Qibla. It should be facing Mecca, right? Every mosque or every religious building should be facing Mecca. This has no Qibla. I said, well, how come I've not heard this? And as he was putting out these curious little tidbits, half the class were made up of Muslim students. And they started getting up, going to the door, slamming the door, turning towards Dr. Hadi, and saying not very pleasant things to him, and they never came back. Within 2 weeks, we lost all of our Muslims. 2 weeks. 25 Muslims had left. Now, if you're a professor on a university and you lose half your class, what are you going to do for your career? You cannot lose your students. And so he started toning down, and stop coming to conclusion and stop asking these questions. Well, I love these questions. I saw the reaction of the students. I said, wait a minute. If the Dome of the Rock has no Qibla, then what does that mean, Dr. Hadi? And he wouldn't answer. He didn't want to answer because he didn't want to lose any more students. So I started taking this down to Speaker's Corner. And I started putting it up there. And I got beat up. I mean, physically beat up. They knocked me out. I got one time there were 60 Muslims around me, kicking me. I went unconscious. I had no idea what happened. When the police finally pulled me out, they said a black man came and laid on top of me and took the blows for me. I said, where is he? He had disappeared. I call him Barry, my black angel. I'm a black angel. Barry. He saved my life twice now at Speaker's Corner in the 25 years I've been there. But I suddenly realized this material is potent. This is heavy material. If this is the only reactions Muslims have, is to beat you up or to walk out the door and slam the door and yell at you as you're walking out, if that is the only reaction they have, we got to learn this material. We got to know this material. And that was then in 1995. Some of these students came to me. They said, we can't answer this, but there's a man who can. His name is Dr. Badawi. And they said, we want you to debate him. There it is, Dr. Badawi and myself. He is the world's leading authority on the Quran. He had done 300 videotapes. You know, these old boxes, these old VHS. For those who had gray hair, remember the VHS boxes that we had to use? He had done 300 of these videos just on the Quran. They said he's coming back from Malaysia. He's going to stop in London on his way back to Halifax in Canada. Would you be willing to debate? Well, I hadn't done a debate before. We don't get trained about how to do debates in seminary, not homiletics class. We're trained just to say, make sure that you pick a subject, only keep it to 20 minutes, say 3 things about that subject, make sure you support it in scripture, and then always have a at the end, and then just walk out the door, people shake their hands, say, what a great sermon you've done. Nothing about debating, nothing about getting confronted, or people supporting, and people yelling at you and calling you all kinds of names, giving you death threats. That we weren't taught in homiletics. So I said, okay, let me try it out. And so I went up to see a woman her name was Dr. Patricia Corona. Dr. Patricia Corona is the leading authority on Mecca. She is from Denmark. She reads and writes 15 archaic languages. How many of you can read and write 15 archaic languages? Show of hands. None. She's unique in the world. And these are languages that no one uses anymore. Nabatean Aramaic, Syro-Aramaic, Akkadian. Amazing woman. She's a linguist. She studied there at the same school of Orient African Studies, got her doctorate there, and became head of department at Oxford University when I got to know her. And when I started my thesis, she was my supervisor, and she was the one that actually wrote 2 books, one called Hagerism and the other called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. She shut down Mecca. And all she did was look for source material from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, up until the 7th and 8th century, only using evidence from those centuries, trying to find this city called Mecca. Could not find any reference to the city called Mecca at all. So I said, well, I'm going to use her. I went up to her, and of course, she knew me, and we went into it. By this time, she had a death threat from Oxford University for writing Meccan Trade in 1997, and so she transferred up to Cambridge University, was head of department at that time, and I sat in her office for one afternoon for about 3 hours as we put together this debate. She said, do this, here's a better way to say it, here, why don't you use it? I finally turned to her, I said, Dr. Corona, why aren't you doing this debate? This is your material. You have the languages, you're the one that's done the research. Me, what do I know? I'm just going to mimic you and copy you. She turned to me, she started, she said, Jay, let me tell you something. I have a chair to protect. I have an institution to represent. I could never do this debate. I don't have the freedom to do this debate as an academic. But you have no chair to protect. And the only person you represent, his name is Jesus Christ. What an answer. Here's an atheist telling me that we're the only ones that can do this debate. We have a freedom they don't have. As Christians, we have a freedom because of Jesus Christ that they do not have. So I said, okay, let's go. I did this debate. It took us 2 hours. At the end of the debate, I gave 10 historical challenges, all of them per challenges. He did not have an answer for any of them. He turns to me at the end and he says, you know, Mr. Smith, all you've done is shown us everything you brought is based on silence. There's just nothing there. Granted, there's nothing there. It's based on silence. And the absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence. And he hung me. The absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence. I had nowhere to go. He was right. I didn't have any evidence. He didn't have any evidence. So it's just silence. There was no reference to this man, Muhammad, any reference to the city called Mecca. We can't find any manuscript for any book called the Quran. None of this we can find in the 7th century. But that's just silence. Where's the evidence?
Stop it!
How do you prove evidence for something that never existed? Do you see the problem, folks?
Awesome.
That was 1995. This is 2025. 30 years later.
Awesome.
Everything I'm going to do is based on evidence. We find this.
Hurry up. I don't trust you. Cool.
But here's what's fascinating. Everything's turned on its head. Because if we have the evidence, then what do they have? Absolutely.
Oh my God, stop.
Now suddenly, everything the Muslims are going to present is based on silence. They have no evidence for their man Muhammad. Okay? Now, no one has dared to debate me on this until this year. And a man named Ibrahim, but before I just go thing about. Because this was causing a huge wave and a lot of problems there at Speaker's Corner, a lot of the Christians were getting quite upset, especially the Anglican Church. And I was not Anglican, and I was an American there in Britain. Who was this American doing causing all these problems there in Britain? And so Colin Chapman, you can see him over on the right, he was in charge and responsible for all the Islamic work for the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so he came to me and said, Jay, you've got to stop what you're doing. Do not do this. He says, we're going to put together a debate. And it's going to be an internal debate. It's going to be between you and Dr. David Marshall, who you see his picture there with the glasses. Dr. David Marshall has a doctorate from Oxford University on the Quran, so he's an academic himself. And we're going to bring in scholars, all of them are Christians, so this is what we call an in-house debate. And it's between you and Dr. Marshall, and it's going to be on basically 2 subjects. Should we use historical criticism, and should we use polemics in our engagement with Muslims? Now, you know where I stood on both those issues. I said yes to both those issues. He said no to both those issues. We should not use historical criticism, and we should not use polemics. Polemics? What do I mean by polemics? Anybody here not know what polemics is? Oh boy, okay. All right, how do I define polemics? Well, I told you what apologetics is, right? Just defending the faith. Defending means making sure that whenever anybody confronts Jesus or our Bible, we answer them. That's called apologetics. It's much like your football team. You have a football team here. I'm not going to ask you which one's the favorite because you'll start fighting with each other. So let's just say, whatever is your favorite football team, don't you have 2 teams within every football team? One called defense and the other called offense? And don't they have 2 different skills? The defense has to make sure that the others don't score against them and score the touchdown. The big guys, they're really muscular, and boy, are they hard because they create walls to stop the others from scoring, right? The offense, however, has a totally different object. They have to push against the other, but they can run and they can toss and they're a lot more exciting, and they're the ones that actually win the game, right? They're the ones whose names you hear. They're the ones who have the highest salary. And see, in Christianity, defense would be apologetics. Offense would be polemics. It's as simple as that. So if you're defending the faith, you better know everything you can about the Bible and Jesus. Those are the 2 things you need to know. If you're going on the offense, especially against Islam, you better know the Quran, you better know Muhammad. But how many of you have studied the Quran or studied Muhammad? Few hands. We don't teach that here. There is no school in the world that teaches Islamic apologetics or polemics except ours. MAPI, Master of Arts in Apologetics and Polemics to Islam. And guess at what institution that is being taught? Veritas International University. That's your university, folks. It's a Calvary Chapel seminary. Did you not know that? Veritas International University is your seminary in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The only place on earth where you can learn Islamic apologetics and polemics. And I direct it, and I have 5 of us. All of us have doctorates. Every one of us have had either 20 years or more experience engaging with Muslims both apologetically and polemically. Now do you know what apologetics and polemics is? Office is defense, polemics is offense. It's as simple as that. 2 different sets of skills. And in many discussions, you have to use both simultaneously. And I had to do that every Sunday afternoon. I would have to use sometimes defense, and then I go on the offense. They throw the questions, I'd answer, then I go the same questions right back in their laps. And that we're not teaching anybody until now. I've just come back from England. I have to be careful. I'm not going to say too much, but there was something that happened about 3 weeks ago in England, in London, where we brought all the best polemicists in the world together in one place. I brought them all over. 15, the top polemicists in the world against Islam. And about 300 then showed up. They all had to be people we knew. It was an invitation only. I'm not going to tell you where it was because I don't want the Muslims to find out where it was. And we went for 3 days just learning how to use polemics, how to use internal polemics and cultural polemics and external polemics. I'll explain that a little bit later. And for 3 days, 300 of us learned how to confront Islam head on. And then Sunday, we went down to Speaker's Corner and shut down the corner. It was so much fun. You'll see the videos. It is amazing. I had my ladder and I had another ladder next to me, and I had 50 different people get up on the ladder the first time for most of them, and they used the best polemics they could come across, and the Muslims have no idea how to shut us down. And then we went up to a restaurant afterwards, and 150 of us had dinner together, and I looked at all these guys and gals, and they're all in their 20s and 30s, folks. They're young. Every one of them is more eloquent than me, quicker than me, smarter than me. Boy, we're going to let them off and unleash them on the Muslim world. You got to realize we are going to take this one. That just happened 3 weeks ago. We're going to do it again next year, and the year after that. We're raising up a whole new generation of young men and women who are quick, and they are bright, and they are fearless. There's no fear in any of them. Oh, I love that. It is so nice. So anyways, back to the story. We had this debate, 2 hours, and there was 50 academics who were there, all Christians. And after 2 hours, I was arguing, yes, we should use polemics, yes, we should use historical criticism. He was saying, no. After 2 hours, we finished the debate, and then they had a show of hands. They wanted to know how many were with Dr. David Marshall, how many came with me. 25 went with him, 25 went with me. Who do you think went with him, the academics or the missionaries? Okay, I'm getting both, so you're right. For those who are correct, you're right. It was the academics who went with him, and the missionaries went with me. I couldn't understand that. I thought, for heaven's sake, academics would go with me, because this is all academic material. It's all historical. We're but in academia. But they all went with him, and I didn't understand until Dr. Peter Riddell that explained to me. And on the way home, he was in my car with me, and he said, Dave, let me explain something. I'm an academic. In fact, he was the professor for my doctorate. He was the one that helped me get my doctorate at Melbourne School of Theology. He's Australian, and he's an academic there. And he said, we academics, we understand what you're doing. We understand why you're doing it, but we can't do this. Because in our institution, there are many Muslims who are on staff with us. We can't use polemics and historical criticism, not in our academics. We'd lose our chairs. We would be thrown out. We'd lose our tenure. But you, as a missionary, he would say the same thing to me that Dr. Patricia Cohen had said back in 1995. Isn't that interesting? I realized the penny dropped. This is something we have to do. This is something we must do, those of us who are on the ground. Since then, our material has really matured. We have gone much quicker, much faster. And of course, in the last 20, 30 years, by 2023, I came here to this church, and I presented the book, The Man in the Place, just those 3 subjects right here in the same hall, and there were about 2,000 people here. They didn't even know who I was, because it was a Wednesday night, and Jack Hibbs couldn't make it, so he asked if I could do it. I said, okay. So it was kind of an audience that just made up people who wanted to hear Jack Hibbs, and I was here instead. And they just kind of looked at me like a deer in front of a headlight, because they had no idea what I was talking about. And I wasn't sure that they would ever understand what I was talking about, so I just said, just look at the screen. Follow the screen. For those of you who remember that, a lot of you who were here, you probably didn't know who I was or what I was going to talk about. And when you left, you said, what in the world did he just say? That, as John is right, 2.6 million people have watched that all over the world. On my site, over 500,000 have watched that. So it's over 3 million people have watched that. It's gone all over the world, and that's why they had to come back and unpack it for 4 hours to slow it down. Now, since then, since 2023, no one's really taken me on. They can't, because how can you take me on? In order to take me on, you have to have evidence from the 7th century. As you can see tonight, there just is no evidence that supports that man, that book, or that place. Until April of this year, and then a man named Raymond Ibrahim, who's a Christian, put up these 2 videos in April of this year. Raymond Ibrahim, how many of you know who Raymond Ibrahim is? Okay, 1. Yeah, good man, fine Christian debater. And he's the only one that's dared to do this. And I thank God that he did this, because he put up 2 videos, one on April 9th and the other one on April 11th, basically saying that, and he's really attacking me. He says, I don't think Jay knows what he's talking about. He said, this idea that Muhammad didn't exist is not only laughable, it is probably the worst polemic at all to use. It's the weakest polemic we could ever use. The weakest polemic you can use. Isn't that interesting? So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to shut him down. I'm going to take the 10 accusations. And he gave 10 accusations. If you're watching Raymond, thank you for doing this, because finally I have an academic who's actually taking me on these subjects. And you gave 10 good questions. And these are the same questions you're going to hit if you go out in the world and if you talk to Muslims. And the number one first thing is Muhammad is one of the most historically supported people in history. So you cannot say he didn't exist, because there's so much historical support for him. Number 2, in fact, Muhammad has more historical support for him than Jesus has. Ooh, I love that. Number 3, if Muhammad did not exist, how can you explain the Sunni-Shiite divide? The Sunnis who are confronting the Shiites from Iran and Iraq. Look what's going on in the world right now. Look at all the problems. It's all between Sunnis and Shiites. How can you explain that if Muhammad didn't exist? Number 4, there are no incontrovertible proofs of Muhammad's non-existence. Ooh, that's a real whammy. I can see someone laughing already, because you can see it's a contradicting term. Since the traditions, that's the Islamic traditions about Muhammad, are so embarrassing, why would they write them? He's such an embarrassment, Mr. Smith. Number 6, Mecca. You can't use Mecca against Muhammad. It's not an argument you can use against Muhammad. Number 7, no one can prove or disprove historical fact. Ooh, boy, that's a whammy. And it comes down to a matter of faith. It doesn't matter what you find. Muslims will always believe it. Number 9, the claims against Muhammad's existence are merely an academic and subjective exercise. That's all it is. Just because you don't like Muslims, is what he said. Boy, I wonder where he got that from. And then number 10, the best polemic is not the historical polemic. The best polemic is just to show how irrelevant Muhammad is. Confront his character. Confront his morality. That's the best polemic. That's what we call the internal polemic. So tonight, what I'm going to do, let's go through each one of these 10 to see if Ibrahim or Raymond, actually I should call him Raymond. I'm going to call him Raymond from here on out, because I have 2 good friends named Ibrahim. One is Ayman Ibrahim, and the other one is Raymond Ibrahim. I don't know Raymond Ibrahim. I've never met him. I'm sure he's a great guy. But I know Ayman Ibrahim, and Ayman Ibrahim actually set up SES on the Islamic branch there. He's in charge of the entire Islamic work, and he absolutely stands with me on this position. So rather than call him Ibrahim, because people confuse which Ibrahim, let's just call Raymond and Ayman, okay? We'll stick with Raymond from here on out. So here we go. This is what the Muslims claim. This is what the Islamic traditions claim. This is what the standard Islamic narrative says. Isn't that great? Standard Islamic narrative, S-I-N. This is what Sin tells us. Muslims sin is traditional claims. They say this: for the past 1400 years, Muhammad was the last and greatest prophet. He modeled Islam as the paradigm for the world. He received the Quran as his final revelation for the world. Therefore, the Quran, his revelation, was sent down only to him between 610 and 632. It is the greatest, the only perfectly preserved revelation, and also the final revelation. It corrects the previously corrupted revelation, in other words, our revelation. And therefore, Mecca was the city Muhammad was born in and lived in for the first 52 years of his life. Thus, Islam is completely dependent on 3 things. Now, this you've seen before. For those of you who are here before, these are the 3 things: one book called the Quran, one man named Muhammad, and one place called Mecca. Since these 3 areas are foundational to Islam, we should investigate them at the time they all existed. That means in the early 7th century, and in the place they existed. That means the central western part of Arabia, known as the Hijaz, where Mecca and Medina are located. So notice, these 3 things are what holds up Islam. It's like 3 legs of a stool. You have the Quran, you have Muhammad, and you have Mecca as the 3 legs. If you start to attack one of those legs and it finally collapses, the other 2 collapse as well. All 3 are needed. You can't have one without the other. One without the other 2. Are you following that? With that in mind, let's now look at Raymond's 10 suppositions and assess them one by one. Supposition number 1. Muhammad is one of the most historically supported people in history. How many people, just show of hands, believe that? Wow, not one of you. I'm already got you converted. We can go on to supposition number 2 then. No, we need to go with supposition 1 so you know how to answer this, okay? Now, to understand what he's talking about, we need to look at what they're saying. This is what he says. This is what the Muslims will say. They would believe that if you look at that map there, the Muhammad Empire included that brown area. So that's that area right there, over on this side, right there. I'm going to do this to both sides, okay? That brown area where Mecca and Medina. Look where Mecca and Medina are. They're right in the central western part of that brown area. So when he died in 632, that's as large as Islam was. Once he died, then you have Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the next four caliphs, what they call the rightly guided caliphs, then come to power, and they expand the borders out. And so it includes all the orange area from Tripoli all the way to India, and from Turkey all the way down to Yemen. Over on this side, from Tripoli to India, and from Turkey all the way down to Hadramaut, or what is today Yemen and Oman. That's a pretty big area. So it is by far, by 661, it is the second largest superpower of its day by that time. And then when the Umayyads come to power in 661, starting with Muawiyah, he and others after him up until 749, for the next roughly 100 years, they expanded out to the purple area. So it includes Spain all the way to India, and then from Yemen all the way to Turkey. Over here, there's Spain, and there's India, and there's Turkey, and there's Yemen. So all that area comes under their jurisdiction. That's their story. And there's been no reason not to confront it or dissuade you from it, because it's a pretty good story. I mean, that's all we've been told. Right? There's a man named Muhammad, and there were four caliphs that followed after him, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. But I'm going to show you there's a problem with that. Let's look and see where we get Islam's emergence. Let's put it on a timeline so you can see what's going on. So Muhammad, according to what the Islamic narrative, the standard Islamic narrative, Sin tells us, is that Muhammad was born in 570. He started receiving his revelation, place called Mecca, in 610. And then in 621, he suddenly is woken up in the middle of the night and told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, who flies him up from Mecca up to Jerusalem, up to the seventh heavens, and meets Allah, who tells him to participate 50 times a day. He comes down to the fifth heaven, meets Moses. That's way too many. So he bounces back and forth between the fifth and the seventh heaven, getting it down from 50 to 45 to 35 to 15 to 10, down to 5 prayers. Once he gets into 5 prayers, Moses, okay, that's enough. So he shuts back down to Jerusalem, gets on back of the winged horse and flies back to Mecca. That happens in 621. It's known as the Mi'raj. You've all heard this before. This is nothing new. And then in 622, he then moves from Mecca up to Medina and takes over, and that's where the caliphate starts in 622. He then comes back to Mecca and takes over Mecca. So now he controls both Mecca and Medina in 630, and he controls the holy places where the Kaaba is. And then he dies in 632, poisoned by one of his wives. So that's his life. That's the timeline to show you what Muhammad's life is like. And then Abu Bakr comes. He only lasts 2 years. He then dies peacefully. That he is followed by Umar, who only lasts 10 years. He is killed. So when he is killed, Uthman takes over. He only lasts 12 years. He is killed, but while he is in power, the Quran is put together. When he is killed, Ali takes over, the adopted son of Muhammad, and he only lasts 5 years before he is killed at the Battle of Siffin by Muawiyah. So what am I putting that out there? What we're saying, according to what standard Islamic narrative tells us, and what Raymond Ibrahim tells us, that Islam was fully formed by 661, right? Mid-7th century. We're talking about the 7th century still, 1400 years ago. Now here's the problem. How do we know everything I just told you? And I've not told you much. I just told you bare bones, because we have to be careful of time. That's what they tell us. Where did that story come from? That's what you want to know. Well, the story comes from the Islamic tradition, the standard Islamic narrative. This is what they tell us. And when you go to the standard Islamic narrative, they tell us that Muhammad dies in 632, and the person that writes his biography down is this guy, Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq. The only problem is, look when he died. Whenever you see a D, that means his death date. I'm because they can't write anything after they die, all right? So I'm putting the last possible time they could have written something down. 765. Do you see a problem with that, folks? Did Ibn Ishaq know Muhammad? Did he ever see Muhammad? Did he hear Muhammad? So how did he know his biography? Do you have anything written by Ibn Ishaq? No. So I held this up. Where does this come from? That's not Ibn Ishaq. His name is Ibn Hisham. This guy is the guy that wrote it down. This is the one that took what Ibn Ishaq said, didn't like a lot of it, so he threw it out and only retained what he liked. And so that's what we have today. So these two books, these two volumes, come from a man named Ibn Hisham. Look when he died, 833. That's even later. That's 70 years later. And then another man named Al-Bukhari who wrote down the battles of Muhammad. So they are the ones that actually give us the story of Muhammad's life, not Ibn Ishaq. So bye-bye, Ibn Ishaq. We don't need you. Goodbye. Now that's the first genre. The second genre are known as the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. And they're written down by these guys here. Al-Bukhari is the most important. He is the most prolific. He is the one that was given 600,000 of these stories. And he whittled them all the way down to 7,439. So he throws out 98% and only retains 2%. And he does that before he dies in 870. Then we have Sahih Muslim, who dies in 875, Ibn Midi, 884. Look at the dates. They die. 887, 899 for Dawud, Nisa, 915. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. Did any of them know Muhammad? Did they ever hear him say anything? Yet they write down what he said. They all lived 240 and later, years after Muhammad. That's not the only genre. We have two more genres, the tafsir and the tahrir. That's the commentaries that help you to understand the Quran. You can't make sense of this. 25% of this, even the Muslim scholars don't understand. And of those of you who have read the Quran, how much of it do you understand? It goes all over the place, doesn't it? As we say in India. It jumps all over the place. Stories don't begin, stories don't end. There's no phrase to help you from story to story. Thank God our Bible's not like that, but the Quran is. So you need commentaries to explain it. And that's why the commentaries have to be written. But Luke was the first man to write it down. His name is Al-Tabari, 923. That's over 300 years. That's almost 300 years after Muhammad. So everything we know about who this man was, what he did, and what he said comes from 200 to 300 years later. How many of you are happy with that? You're not happy with it? You're happy with it? You're a good man. I like you. Because I know why you're happy with it, because that makes our job a lot easier, doesn't it? So he's being smart. But let me ask you, sir, you're going to be Abdul right now, right? Abdul. You're happy, you're a Muslim, you love that. What about Jesus Christ? Don't we also have a hadith of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus? Don't we also have a siddha of Jesus, the biography of Jesus? Yes, we do, don't we? For those of you who are Christian, not you, Abdul, you're Muslim, okay? Stay Muslim right now. So, as a Muslim, you don't have anything for 200 to 300 years, but we have the siddha of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Who wrote down what Jesus did. The hadith of Jesus, what he said, that's written in red letters in some of your Bibles. Anytime Jesus spoke, that's the hadith of Jesus. So we have the same genre, right? The tafsir of what Jesus said and did would be the commentaries of Paul's letters. He would take what Jesus said and apply it to Ephesus, and to Philippi, and to Corinth. Right? So there's the tafsir. So we have the same genre in our New Testament, and then the tahqiq, which would be the histories of mankind, that is in the book of Acts, the history of the early church. So we have the same 4 genres that you see up on the screen there. But when were they written? We're going to get to that. Hold on to that, because that's going to answer one of my questions. So you stay right there, Abdul. I'm going to keep talking to you. I like that. When a guy agrees with me, it's so nice fun to have someone that agrees with me. I'm going to put up Abdul Malik's name there because he is the one that actually introduces the name Muhammad. Did I say Muhammad? Ooh, boy, slap my mouth. No, he doesn't. He doesn't introduce the name Muhammad. You're going to see why in about 10 minutes. Nonetheless, he's the first one to get up that title. And it's not Muhammad, as you're going to find out. But it's these people here, the Abbasids, that I just put up, that they're the ones that actually make him into the Muhammad that we know today. And I'm emphasizing Muhammad for a reason. I'm overemphasizing it for a reason. You'll see why. So, conclusion. Muhammad was revealed 84 years after the Abbasids created him, 141 years after he was first introduced, yet 201 years after he supposedly lived. Raymond, however, considers this 200-year gap as perfectly acceptable and thus not a problem. How many of you agree with Raymond? You should raise your hand. You just did. Come on, Abdul, get your hand up there. He's suddenly getting a chicken foot because he knows that he's going to be put on the hot seat. Don't get chicken foot on me, please. Stay there. I want you to be a good Muslim tonight, all right? And here's the other problem. Look at the distance and direction. Now, everything that Muslims, including Abdul sitting here, says happens in those two cities that you see right there that are circled in green. You see them up there? Mecca and Medina. That's where everything happens. That's where all this takes place. That's where Muhammad lived. That's where he was born. There in Mecca. He was there for 52 years, then moved to Medina, and he spent the whole time receiving this book here in those two cities. You see where they are, just so you see them on the map. But here's the problem. Everything we know that's written about him, about his life, does not come from those cities. They come from that city, Baghdad, which is 1,200 miles away. Ibn Hisham, the man who actually wrote that, this guy who wrote on his biography, he was born in Basra, grew up in Cairo, and wrote in Baghdad. Basra is a good 1,200 miles away. Cairo is a good 990 miles away, and of course Baghdad is 1,200 miles. The guy who wrote down his sayings came from Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan, which is 2,600 miles away. The guy who wrote down all the tafsir and the tafsir comes from Tabaristan, which is northern Iran today. That is 1,700 miles. None of these traditional writers lived or worked in Mecca or Medina. They were way too far to the north of Mecca and came from the west and east of Baghdad. Doesn't Raymond realize that these are Abbasid writers, all writing after 750 and way too far away? Has he forgotten about this? Or should we remind him? Abdul, you're his spokesman now. You tell me. Please knock on his door and tell him, all right? And ask him, how is he going to answer this question? Let's continue on. But which Muhammad is Raymond talking about? Which is the Muhammad that you support, Ahmed? Or no, I'm sorry, you're Abdul. I'm going to keep changing your name. Abdul. Okay, Abdul, which is the one you support? See, if you support the Muhammad of Islam, then you have to agree to four things. And Raymond has to agree to these four things. Number one, he must have the name Muhammad that looks like that. There it is. This is the only Arabic I'm going to force on you people tonight, all right? You don't have to learn Arabic tonight, but learn that name there. You know Arabic? You're Egyptian. Okay, is that Muhammad up there? Okay, is there a Dama and a Fat up there? Is there a Mimdal? Okay, so that's Muhammad. Okay, we got our Arab speakers down here. All right, you're going to help me out, all right? The rest of you don't worry about it. Just listen to say yes to everything I say. So that's what Muhammad looks like, right? And whenever you read it, that's what it looks like. Hugely important. You'll see why. Now, he must have lived in the city of Mecca. In order to be the Muhammad of Islam, he had to have come from Mecca. If he didn't come from Mecca, he's no longer the Muhammad of Islam. Because he spent 52 years there, folks. He received half this book there. All right? That's where the holy places are. That's where the Kaaba is. That's where everybody focuses 5 times a day praying towards. So it has to be Mecca. Number 3, he must have received this Quran, all 114 surahs from that place and from that time, and everything had to happen in the 7th century. Those are the 4 things you have to claim. Are you following me, Abdul? You're starting to get a little nervous now. Don't worry. If you're getting nervous, what about Raymond Ibrahim? Okay? So those are the 4 things you have to accept. Conclusion. All 4 of the above criteria, the man, the place, the book, and the time, must be fulfilled in order to prove that the Muhammad of Islam actually existed, that your Muhammad actually existed. All right? So let's go ahead and let's start and let's look at this name. Now, Raymond suggests that we can find the name Muhammad in a written text, just like the one I showed you. Mim, ha, mim, dal, with a dama, fata, and fata. All right? But that name requires 4 consonants and 3 vowels. Am I correct? In the 7th century, there were no vowels. There were no vowels in the Arabic text. Today there are, right? But back in the 7th century, there were only 16 consonants. How many consonants are there in the text today? 28. That's right, thank you. 28 today, but 16 back then. Where did they get the other 12 from? They didn't exist in the 7th century. They had to be created in the 8th and 9th century. All right? Are you following this? You're my Arab speakers, okay? If you get it, the rest of you will not get it. But as long as you get it, that's important, okay? So the earliest Quranic manuscripts, now look at them. Here they are. I'm giving you 5 of the earliest 6 manuscripts. I want my Arab speakers to go up and read what's up there on those scripts. Can you read it? No, you cannot. It is Arabic. What's wrong with it? You can't read a word of it, can you? You can try to guess what it is, but you need 5 dots, don't you? If you have 1 dot above a little bold face, that becomes a nun, right? If you have 2 dots, it becomes a ta. If you have 3 dots, it becomes a tha. If you have 1 dot below, it becomes a ba. And 2 dots becomes a ya. Not ta, ba, ya. Do you see them up there? Not 1 dot. So you can't read it, can you? And yet these are the earliest Quranic manuscripts. And these are not from the 7th century. These are from the 8th and 9th century. So what Muhammad are you talking about? Where's Muhammad there? Because Muhammad requires 3 vowels. Do you see any vowels in any of those manuscripts? Do you see any damas or kasras or fatas? I don't see any. And this is why Raymond hasn't done his history. Are you listening to this, Abdul? Please listen. This is for you too. I know you don't know Arabic, but they agree with me. In the 7th century, there were no 5 dots. Today, there are 5 dots. These diacritical marks had to be invented because nobody could read that. You can't read it. But that's why they had to be created in the 8th and 9th century. So with that in mind, what does the word Muhammad look like today? That's what it looks like today, all right? You both agree with me that. But since there were no vowels back then, this is what it looked like back then. Now read it. Ooh, did you hear? Muhammad. So suddenly it goes from Muhammad to Muhammad. Thank you. Let's give her a hand. Abdul, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be clapping. This is shutting you down. You just keep it somber for a while, okay? So now it's become Mimha Mimdal with no vowels, which means this is a word. It's not Muhammad, but it's Muhammad. How do we know that? How can we prove that right now? Well, we need to go to John of Damascus, good old John of Damascus. See, John of Damascus was there in the courts of the Malik from 685 to 705. He was a Christian. He was there in Damascus. That's why he's called John of Damascus. He was a treasurer for of the Malik. And so he was watching what was happening, and he was seeing that this dispute was happening between the Ishmaelites and those who come from the line of Isaac. The Jews and the Christians come from the line of Isaac, but the Umayyads were Ishmaelites, and they did not have a prophetic line. They didn't have any scripture like the Jews and the Christians had. And yet they controlled now from, by the time of the Malik comes to power, from Spain all the way to India, and from Turkey all the way to Yemen. So they were the second biggest superpower of the day. The problem is they had no identity. The Byzantine Empire, the other biggest empire that there was, the biggest competitor, they had a prophetic line. They had a scripture. They had a whole series of prophets. What did the Ishmaelites have? They needed a prophet, and they needed a book of Revelation that would equal what was going on. So he was watching this, right? He sees this all happening. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't write anything because he's under their employ. So when he retires in 730, now look at the date, 730, we're well into the 8th century. We're 100 years after Muhammad had died. If Muhammad had existed, he then writes his greatest masterpiece. And what does he title it? Look at the title. The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. Ooh, I love that. Why does it say Heresy of the Muslims? Because there were no Muslims that early. Muslims, that word did not exist. We can't find any reference for anybody called Muslims. No Muslims. So he calls them Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites. Now we see what's going on. And he talks about this prophet that these Ishmaelites have. This, what does he say? He says that from that tonight, a false prophet called Muhammad. Now notice he's writing in Greek. In Greek, the vowels are there. Look at the Greek. Those who can read Greek. What does it say up there on the top left? This circle. Muhammad. It's Muhammad. John of Damascus tells us what it is. It's Muhammad. So this Muhammad, who, after conversing with an Aryan monk, who are the Aryans? They didn't believe that Jesus was God. They didn't believe in the Trinity. And they didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They didn't believe Jesus at all was divine. Arius is the one that brought this up in the 4th century. The Arian controversy has been around ever since, almost from the 2nd century. You have the Ebionites bringing up the same problem. Arius brought this up in the 4th century. Athanasius was told to shut him down at the Council of Nicaea, which he did, and here it raises his head again. And there is John Damascus watching this. He's ringside cheek seat, and he writes his greatest piece. And he says, this Muhammad, this new prophet, this Arian monk who get your material from, and he goes on, he fabricates his own heresy, and then he talks about that this monk has 4 books. The book of the cow, ooh, that's Surah 2 in the Quran today. The book of the woman, that's Surah 4 in the Quran today. The book of the table, that's Surah 5 in the Quran today. And the book of the camel, there is no Surah called the camel. But what are 4 books doing when there's supposed to be only one book called the Quran? Isn't that interesting? This is 730, well into the 8th century. But now we know who this Muhammad is. His name is not Muhammad, his name is Muhammad. So who in the world is Muhammad? Wait till you find out. Here we go. What does Muhammad mean in Arabic? It is not a name, it is a title. It means the praised one, the blessed one, the anointed one, or even the Messiah. It's a title, folks. Have any of you heard this name before? You have? Where have you heard it? Okay, in Arabic. But where did you hear it before Arabic? How about Hebrew? Anybody here speak Hebrew? Anybody studied Hebrew? Have you looked at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament? You will find Muhammad 11 times in the Old Testament. Muhammad is well known in the Bible. You didn't know that, did you? Well, here we go. The Uyghurs were the first to introduce this word in 1400 BC, the Muhammad, the praised one, the anointed one. It was then borrowed in Hebrew in 1000 BC and put into our Bibles 11 times. Song of Solomon 5:16, the Muhammad, the altogether lovely one, the praised one that Solomon's referring to. There's the Muhammad we're looking for. Now, by the 4th century, St. Ambrose, the early church father, took it. Remember, Arabic comes from Aramaic, which comes from Hebrew. So therefore, it's all the same letters. They use all the same letters. They're all Semitic letters. They use the same consonantal text. And therefore, St. Ambrose, writing in Syriac, talks about this Muhammad from Song of Solomon 5:60. And he says, this is a title for Jesus Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah. That's what the anointed one is. From that time on, from the 4th century AD, this Muhammad was employed by many of the church fathers. Here's some examples. Origen, in the early 3rd century, the Christian theologian interpreted the Song of Solomon 5:16, a passage as the unique scripture where the eschatological neutrals of Christ and his bride are present. St. Ambrose, in the 4th century AD, introduced the ideas of that Song of Solomon 5:16 passage referred to Muhammad was to be considered a title for Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Greg of Elvira continued the idea in the late 4th century. St. John Cassian continued that in the 5th century. St. Augustine, the great church father, continued that in the 5th century. And then Apollonius, in the middle of the 7th century, also believed that this Muhammad was Jesus Christ. Conclusion, the title Muhammad, not the name Muhammad, the title Muhammad, was a common title for Jesus by the 7th century in the church in that part of the world, especially in Arabic, which took it from Aramaic. So we should not be surprised when we find it written in many places at that time. It's written all over the place. That's why we find Muhammad after Muhammad after Muhammad. But it's not just the Christians, the Jews also use that title in Hebrew. If you have any doubts, just take a look at this inscription from 523. This is a good 100 years before Muhammad even came in, when Muhammad died. And it's a 6th century Jewish rock inscription in what is today Yemen. It's there in Najrah. And it is translated by the Lord of the Jews by the Muhammad. The Muhammad in Sabbaic script, I'm just putting it out so you can see it there in Sabbaic script. This is not the Arabic script that we see in the Quran. This is the Sabbaic script that comes from Yemen. It is Arabic, but it's not the same script. Isn't that interesting? But look at the term Muhammad that is used there by the Jews. So let's show you a quick synopsis. Muhammad means the praised one, or the blessed one, or the anointed one, or even the Messiah later on. So it's not a name. It's not a name, folks. It's a title. It was used in Arabic in 1400 BC, borrowed by the Jews in Hebrew in 1000 BC. That's why you have it 11 times in our Bible. It was subsequently employed by St. Ambrose in the 4th century as a title for Jesus Christ. The Jews also referred to it in their reference. And what was interesting, by the 7th century, the Jews started using that title for their exilarchs. The exilarchs were those who were in charge of the seminary in what is today Baghdad, Arabic. So they've all been speaking Arabic, and they always put Muhammad before their name. Muhammad ben Huziel, Muhammad ben David, Muhammad ben everyone. They had 5 different exilarchs where they put Muhammad before the name, the praised one, the anointed one. It was a title of endearment, of authority, of credibility. Well used in Arabic and Aramaic by the 7th century. Thus, by the 7th century, the Christians used Muhammad to refer to the returning Messiah, while the Jews used Muhammad to refer to the Messiah yet to come, and at times interchanged it with the Messiah. Conclusion, therefore, the term Muhammad was well known in that part of the world and at that time, but it was not pronounced Muhammad like you do today. That is how we now pronounce it. And there lies the confusion that Reagan's having, and same with you, Abdul. I can see you're confused now as well. So, folks, knowing that, let's now look and see exactly when Muhammad's story was created within Islam itself. All right? So we're not looking for Muhammad anymore. We need to look for Muhammad. That's what we need to look at. You need to go to the evidence from that century. So how well did the Muslims preserve Muhammad's story, their Muhammad's story? Now we're getting back to the Muhammad of Islam, your Muhammad, Abdul, okay? And Raymond's Muhammad. How well did they preserve their manuscripts? Now here's the problem. When anyone asks Muslims how they can be sure that the story they have of Muhammad is true, this one right here, this story by Ibn Hisham, they point to numerous books on their bookshelves, including this one right here, and claim that they were written by those who knew Muhammad. Did Ibn Hisham know Muhammad? No, he died in 833. That's 200 years later. He certainly did not know Muhammad. But they saw what he did and they heard what he said, but they never show us their original extant codices or their original manuscripts. Nor did they ever give us any forensically tested dates concerning when exactly those books were originally written. To be valid witnesses for Muhammad, we must have their traditional writers' original extant manuscripts. So the question I'm asking is, where is the original extant manuscript for Ibn Hisham? That's all I'm asking. That which they actually wrote. Remember, the compilers of the Prophet's life, Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, and what he said, Al-Bukhari, Ibn Dawud, Ibn Najah, and Nasai, all of them were living in the caliphal courts. They were there in Baghdad. Therefore, they had all the wealth to their disposal. They did not have to depend on papyrus, like the early church fathers had to depend on. All of our tafsir and our tahqiq and our hadith were all written on papyrus, which are these interlocking leaves, and they disintegrate within 100 years. They get dry and cripple away. That's not the case for the Muslims. Are you hearing this, Abdul? That's not the case for you guys, because you were in the caliphal courts. You were in the richest land in the world, the richest place. Therefore, you did not use papyrus. You would have used parchment or vellum, animal skins. If that were so, then those extant manuscripts still be available today. We should still see them. Where are they, Abdul? I'm picking on him because Raymond Ibrahim's not here today. You can go and shake hands with Abraham. You're picking on his place for him. And that's what we need to ask Muslims. Where are these original manuscripts for the Sirah, for the Hadith, for the Tafsir, for the Tahqiq, for all of these references that you're talking about, and including the Sahaba and the Tabi'un? Now, the Sahaba and the Tabi'un, the Sahaba would be the companions of the Prophet, okay? The equivalent thing we would have would be Matthew and John. They were the companions of Jesus. They were right there watching what Jesus did and hearing what Jesus said. So they would be our Sahaba. The Tabi'un were those who got it from the Sahaba. So they would be like Mark and Luke, who got it from the eyewitnesses, okay? So 2 different generations. First generation would be the companions. The second were those who got it from the companions, okay? So we have the same equivalent in Christianity, right? So Muslims are saying that we do have the Sahaba and we do have the Tabi'un. Are you ready? So we have spent 2 years. What I'm going to show you now, no one's seen yet, okay? This is 2 years worth of study. We decided to find out where these manuscripts are. No one has done this work until we did. It's just coming out of Europe right now, so you're getting it. Here we go. So the Sahaba, the eyewitnesses or the companions of the Prophet in the Tabi'un, those who received what they knew from the Sahaba. What we're told by Muslims is that there are many Sahaba. Actually, they only list about 5 of them in the Tabi'un. They were writing in the 7th and the 8th century. This is a lie. You ready? Let's see who they quote. These are the ones they quote. Muwatta of Ibn Malik. It comes not from the 7th century. It comes from the 9th century. The Sahifa of Haman bin Munabi. It does not come from the 7th century. It comes from the 12th century. That's 500 years later. The Musnad of Ibn Hanbal. It comes from the 13th century. That's 600 years later. It comes from the Musnad of Abdul Razak. That's 600 years later. Along with the Musnad of Al-Tayyizi. That's 1300. That's 600 years later. And Abi Shayba. That's 600 years later. Not one of these from the 7th and 8th century. All of that has been a lie. And we didn't know that until the last 2 years because we assumed that they had the manuscripts. They have no manuscript for any of these guys. These documents were all supposedly created in the 7th century. That's what Muslims tell us. Yet they do not begin to appear until the 9th to the 13th century. That's 200 to 600 years too late. This suggests that they were all written by others hundreds of years later. Consequently, they are all redacted attributions. Now, let's put that on a timeline. Show you what I'm talking about. So when the Muslims, when you come up and they say, we know who the Sahaba and who the Tabi'un, they're looking at these 5, 6 guys right here. That's where they put them right up next to Muhammad there. None of them come from there. The first one, the earliest one is Ibn Malik. That's from the 9th century. They get Munabi, 12th century. You have Hanbal, 13th century, along with Razak. And then you have Al-Isi, and then you have Ibn Shayba. All of them are 12th and 13th century. Can you see the problem, folks? Therefore, the Sahaba and the Tabi'un, they are not first and second generations. They are not eyewitnesses. Our equivalent would be Matthew and John. Yet they were written 200 to 600 years later and simply redacted back to the 7th and 8th century. Thus, they are probably fraudulent. Now, since we started introducing this onto Fander Films, which I started doing this spring, the Muslims are coming back to, Mr. Smith, yes, but we have the Musnad, the Muwatta of Ibn Malik. The Muwatta of Ibn Malik is 9th century. Have you heard them say this? Maybe you haven't. But Abdul, you've been saying a lot of times. You wanted to copy on this a week ago. And you've been hammering me on this. What about the Muwatta of Ibn Malik? You see, that's 9th century. That's 9th century. You say, that's only 200 years after Muhammad. Okay, let's go back and see if that's true. Let's take a look. There's a partial copy of the Muwatta in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. And it is described as the second third of a celebrated treatise on the Islamic jurisprudence and is dated 890. I will give you that, Abdul. But here's the problem. When does the Muwatta get finalized? It does not. The complete manuscript of the Muwatta does not get finalized until 1030. That's the 11th century. So you really have nothing earlier than the 11th century. What's more, as of today, 1030 manuscript is the earliest fully extant copy of Ibn Malik's work. But here's the problem. Who cares? Ibn Malik has nothing to do with Muhammad. Has nothing to do with the origins of Islam. Ibn Malik is nothing more than about the rules of jurisprudence. It's nothing about the origin. He's just talking about the rules that existed in the 9th and 10th and 11th century. So why is he even in the discussion? Do you see the problem? You're using the wrong genre, Abdul. Sorry. I know you're going to have a hard time after this. We'll go up to dinner together and I'll pay for your meal. Now, knowing that, since we know that, let's relook at the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. Let's put them on a timeline. So Abdul and Raymond and the other Muslims, they claim that they're all hugged up against Muhammad. No, they're not. And they are first put the Muwatta of Ibn Malik is there, but we now know that he's not there. Actually, he is here. So goodbye to Ibn Malik. He doesn't belong there, and so do the others. So really, they don't begin to appear until the 11th century. So everything we know about these Sahaba or these Tabi'un do not come from the 7th and 8th century. They come from the 11th to the 13th century. That's 400 to 600 years too late. And this is the first time you're hearing that. What about the Sirah? What about the biography? What about this book right here? What about this biography of Muhammad? We've been told that it comes from Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, and that's the classic book that you will get whenever you go to school. That's the book you have to read. Everybody has to read that book. You recognize it, don't you? And you've always trusted it, haven't you? Until today. Who wrote that book? Well, it's right there on the cover. The name's right there. Rasul Allah. The Sirah Rasul Allah written by Ibn Ishaq. Do you have any manuscript of Ibn Ishaq? No. So when you open up the pages of that book and you read the introduction, it's very clear that Ibn Ishaq had nothing to do with that book. In fact, it all comes from Ibn Hisham. That's what it says. But here's the problem. We don't have any manuscript of Ibn Hisham. So who actually wrote that book that you read and that everybody reads today? You want to know? You ready? This old gentleman right here wrote it. Heinrich Ferdinand Wustenfeld, a German scholar who between 1858 and 1860 compiled the biography of Muhammad. He then published it in 1860. That's 160 years ago. And everybody in the world now knew who Muhammad was. Therefore, the man who Muslims are dependent on, and same with you, Abdul, and Raymond, who's listening, are dependent on to know who their prophet is or what he did, is an elderly German linguist who wrote Muhammad's story 160 years ago. That's over 1,000 years too late. Did you not know this? This is the first time you're hearing this. I talked about this over a year ago. So where did he get his material from? That's the next question. Where did he get his material from? You just need to read his notes. Look at his notes. He explains where he gets it from. He goes to 6 different manuscripts. Are you ready? These are the 6 manuscripts he goes to. He does not go to these 2 guys. This is the one he should have gone to, Ibn Hisham and al-Waqidi. He goes to, there he is right there. He went to this manuscript in Fez in Morocco, dated to 1063, and another manuscript that comes from the British Library that's there today, that's dated from 1278. Another one that comes from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, that's 1300s, and another one that comes from Dublin in Ireland, that is the 1300s as well, and another one that comes from the BNF, the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris in Paris, that is 1400, and the one he used the most comes from the School of Oriental African Studies there in London, and it comes from 1589. Those are the 6 manuscripts he uses. Notice 5 of them are in Europe, one of them's in Morocco, and the one in Morocco he only used 25% of because he didn't trust the other 75%. So none of this comes from anybody named Ibn Hisham or al-Waqidi. They were all written from the 11th to the 16th century. So goodbye, we don't need you guys anymore. Therefore, every Western Muslim scholar believes that the Sirah compilation was just 200 to 300 years after Muhammad, which is bad enough. Won't they be surprised when they find that they are really much later, between the 11th and 19th century? In other words, between 400 to 1200 years after Muhammad. Written by a German scholar. So who really created the 19th century and the 10th century hadith? Now Muslims will say that they were all created by, well, we know who they were created by: Bukhari, Muslim, Dawud, Tirmidhi, Majah, Nisa, all from the 9th century, right? And one from the 10th century. No. That is what they tell us. No, they're all lying. Abu Dawud is from the 11th century. That's 400 years after Muhammad. An-Nasai is from the 12th century. That's 500 years. Ibn Majah is from the 13th century. That's 600 years. Jami' at-Tirmidhi is from the 14th century. That's 700 years. Same with Sahih Muslim. The second most authoritative comes from the 14th century. And Sahih Bukhari, the most authoritative one, the one that gives us 9 volumes, comes from the 14th and 15th century. That's 700 to 800 years after Muhammad. Folks, not one of these hadiths were compiled in the 9th and 10th century. Their final extant manuscripts were not created. Let's go back. Were not created until the 11th to the 15th century, which is 400 to 800 years later. That's not one of them ever heard a word Muhammad said. This is the first time you're hearing it. Let's put it on the timeline. So that's what they say. They were all written there by those men in the 9th and 10th century. No, they weren't. They start to appear by Ibn Dawud in the 11th century, Nasai in the 12th century, Majah in the 13th century, 14th century for At-Tirmidhi, same with Sahih Muslim, and the most important, Al-Bukhari, is not till the 14th and 15th century. Goodbye. Don't need those guys anymore. Which means that everything we have about what Muhammad said comes from 400 to 800 years too late. How can you defend them? Now we come and the Tahqiq and the Tafsir. Now we've been told that the Tahqiq and the Tafsir are written by this guy here, Al-Tabari, and then there are many that come after, Zamashari, Suyuti, and Badawi, and others, but he is the first to write down everything that Islam needs. In fact, everybody loves Al-Tabari because he tells you everything about how you're to walk out, eat, and he tells you all kinds of messed up stuff, and he contradicts himself here and there, and gives you the chance to choose what you want. That's why everybody loves Al-Tabari. He was living in the 10th century, so we're good. No, we have nothing from him in the 10th century at all. Nothing. So where do we get Al-Tabari? It was edited by a man named Jean Gouge, the professor of Arabic at Leiden University in Holland between 1879 and 1901. He is known as the Leiden edition. He went to two manuscripts written in the 13th century, which still exist today in Istanbul. These Arabic manuscripts, these were all written 600 years later, but they were put together and compiled for the whole world to use until the last century. A Dutch scholar. So even Al-Tabi is not taken Tafsir in the 10th century, there are much later 15th century compilations which were merely attributed back to Al-Tabi 200 years early, yet they are still 600 years too late. What's more, it took a Dutch scholar to compile 1,200 years later. Why didn't the Muslims do this? Because the Muslims never wasted time doing this. They had no idea what Al-Tabi said in the last century. It's amazing. And yet Muslims and Raven says they're more historically accurate than any other person. So, put everything on one screen, ready? Let's put it all together on one screen. We get your pictures. So let's start with the and that's when they say they're put up there. That's when they believe that they actually were written. No, we now know that they were written. Let's put away the 11th century and the 12th century and the 13th century and the 13th and the 13th and the 13th again. So you never wrote a thing. So we now know about the hadith. Well, they were telling us that the 6 hadith were written there. No, they weren't. They were actually written in the 11th and the 12th, the 14th and the 15th century. Written by those two guys, Hisham and Wakili, in the 9th century. No, according to our German, the 13th and the 14th century, and then up into the 15th and the 16th century, written by this guy here, put together in goodbye to Wakili and to Ibn Hisham. And then we're told that the Tafsir and the Tathik were written in the 11th century by Al-Tabi. No, they weren't. They actually came from 6 manuscripts. I'm sorry, 2 manuscripts that are Istanbul, but put together by this. Which means, when you look at this, Muslims claim that everything happened 200 to 300 years after Muhammad, right? No, it didn't. What we now know is that everything happened not 200 to 300 to 900 years after Muhammad. We put a big X in the area that they claim is. So we've been told the stories around Muhammad's life were written by those who saw and heard him, thus by eyewitnesses or by others within a few generations. Yet we see above that everything we know about Muhammad was originally written 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived, yet not canonized into written text until 1270 years later, suggesting it is all a fraud. Let me put them all up there. That's what you can get. Picture, get this PowerPoint, get that picture, and then just give it to your Muslim friends. They've got to come up with an answer to that. Looking at this timeline above, how can Raymond Ibrahim suggest that the history of Muhammad is one of the best supported in history? How can he say that when those who wrote it did so a full 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived, and what's more, he do with the fact that much of it was not canonized into written form until 12 to 1270 years later? Is this the best in history? Are you listening to this, Abdul? You're kind of losing your smile, aren't you? It's getting hard. That he's got a great smile. Now, as a comparison, folks, be careful. We as Christians have done the same thing. We're just as guilty. You know we are. You know the Gnostic Gospels, 52, found in the Nag Hammadi Library, Egypt, written in Coptic, purporting to tell stories of Jesus' childhood, yet were all written in the 4th century and redacted back to the 1st century. But for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, that's the Muslims and the Gospel of Judas, written from the 2nd century, but attributed by their authors to have been written by the disciples of Jesus Christ died. The Gospel of Barnabas, the favorite of Muslims. The favorite gospel by the Muslims was written in 1634 AD, but was attributed to the companion of Paul in the 1st century. They were all written in order to give credibility and authority for those who wrote them. So this practice of redemption attributes is common in every religion, including Christianity. But here's the difference. Listen to it. Maybe if you're watching. The difference is that while the later Muslim traditions are all considered authoritative, and you see on that graph right there, the later Christian traditions are all considered fraudulent. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Thomas. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Judas. That's why we throw out the Gospel of Barnabas. Why? Because they are all written too late. So we throw out that which is written too late, and the Muslims do just the opposite. They hold on and take the latest material and throw out that which has gone earlier. Do you see the problem? So we aren't doing the same thing. We do just the opposite of what the Muslims do. So what does all this mean? I'm not saying and suggesting that there never was someone called Ibn Hisham or Al-Waqidi or Al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim or even Al-Tabi. I'm not saying that. Please don't get that from me today. I'm not saying that because someone certainly had to have created those names somewhere. These men could very well have lived. And they could very well have lived in the 9th and 10th century where they're attributed. Thomas, Judas, and Barnabas did actually live. They were actual people. They were real men who were historical characters in the early church and well respected. And that was why the later compilers attributed their works to them. But they did not write the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Barnabas. That's all I'm saying. In the same token, neither did Al-Waqidi or Ibn Hisham or Al-Bukhari or Muslim or Al-Tabi write what is purported to have been written by them. Because we have nothing from those men. Similarly, that is why I believe later Muslims attribute the stories back in the area that they claim is. So we've been told the stories around Muhammad's life were written by those who saw and heard him, thus by eyewitnesses or by others within a few generations. Yet we see above that everything we know about Muhammad was originally written 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived, yet not canonized into written text until 12 to 1270 years later, suggesting it is all a fraud. Let me put them all up there. That's what you can give to Muslims. Just get that piece, take that picture, get this PowerPoint, get that picture, and then just give it to your Muslim friends. They've got to come up with an answer to that. Looking at this timeline above, how can Raymond Ibrahim suggest that the history of Muhammad is one of the best supported in history? How can he say that when those who wrote it did so a full 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived? And what's more, what will he do with the fact that much of it was not canonized into written form until 12 to 1270 years later? Is this the best in history? Are you listening to this, Abdul? You're kind of losing your smile, aren't you? It's getting harder and harder, isn't it? I love that. He's got a great smile. Now, as a comparison, folks, be careful. We as Christians have done the same thing. We're just as guilty. You know we are. You know the Gnostic Gospels, 52 found.
Shut the fuck. Yo! Oh my God. Oh. Stay over there. Stop.
The Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt, written in Coptic, purporting to, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas. That's the one Muslims love that one. And the Gospel of Judas, written around the 2nd century, but attributed by their authors to. Look at the Gospel of Barnabas, the favorite of Muslims. The favorite gospel by the Muslims was written in 1634 AD, but was attributed to the companion of Paul in the 1st century. They were all written in order to give credibility and authority for those who wrote them. So this practice of redaction and attribution is common in every religion, including Christianity. But here's the difference. Here's the difference. Listen to this, Abdul, and Raven, if you're watching. The difference is that while the later Muslim traditions are all considered authoritative, as you see on that graph I put up there, the Christian traditions are all considered fraudulent. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Thomas. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Judas. That's why we throw out the Gospel of Barnabas. Why? Because they are all written too late. So we throw out that which is written too late, and the Muslims do just the opposite. They hold on and take the latest material and throw out that which has gone earlier. You see the problem? So we aren't doing the same thing. We do just the opposite of what the Muslims do. So what does all this mean? I'm not saying and suggesting that there never was someone called Ibn Hisham or Al-Waqidi or Al-Buhari or Sahih Muslim. I'm not saying that. Please don't get that from me today. I'm not saying that because someone certainly had to have created those names somewhere. These men could very well have lived. And they could very well have lived in the 9th and 10th century where they're attributed. Thomas, Judas, and Barnabas did actually live. They were actual people. They were real men who were historical characters in the early church and well respected. And that was why the later compilers attributed their works to them. But they did not write the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Barnabas. That's all I'm saying. In the same token, neither did Al-Waqidi or Ibn Hisham or Al-Buhari or Muslim or Al-Tabari write what is purported to have been written by them. Because we have nothing from those men. Similarly, that is why I believe later Muslims attribute the stories back to these earlier men. Consequently, what Muslims today contend these historical writers wrote, they have no support for historically. They have no evidence whatsoever. Since they have little to nothing of what they wrote outside of the Muwatta, which is not even a member of the Islamic tradition, so it should not even be in this discussion. All that Muslims can now be certain of is what the later Abbasids and even the early Ottomans believe happened in the 7th and 8th century, since everything that had been written earlier had been destroyed and then replaced with completely new stories to fit a new agenda. Conclusion, when compared to Christianity, which has manuscript evidence within the 1st century, Islam is much less historically supported, contrary to what Raymond contends. Yet it shouldn't be, considering how recent it is supposedly was created, and all of it written on vellum on animal skin. They should have the best material, but they don't. That's just supposition one. I've already I have half an hour to go to the next. Don't worry, they get much shorter. That's the hard stuff. That's the heavy stuff. That's the new material. Here's a second supposition. Muhammad has more historical support than Jesus. Do you believe that? This is what he says. I find it amazing that whereas Christians rightfully cite Josephus and Pliny and Tacitus as early proof of Christ's existence, in other words, the 1st and 2nd century, the non-Muslim references to Muhammad, which objectively speaking are even more compelling since they were written much closer to their subject's lifetime in the 9th and 10th century, are dismissed as irrelevant by those who would make him a figment of our imagination. He therefore claims that since Muhammad is far more historically supported than Jesus Christ, by denying his historicity, we are not only being inconsistent, but possibly dishonest. Abdul, he called me dishonest. You don't call me that. Of course, you're standing right there, you can't. So is Raymond correct? Is the historical support for Muhammad greater than that for Jesus Christ? Here's my response. Both Raymond and I agree that there are many very early 7th century, mostly non-Muslim and even Christian references to the word Muhammad. That's why I had to go through that with you, Kurt, at the very beginning. Notice I didn't say Muhammad. The first, only 2 years after he died. Whereas the first non-Christian references to Jesus do not appear until 60 years after he died. I'm willing to say that. But that's not Muhammad. That's Muhammad. Raymond gives only 4 examples. Actually, there's 15 he could give. He only gave 4, so I'm just going to deal with those 4 because of lack of time. He goes to the Doctrine and Jacobi from 634, citing a dialogue in 634, where Justice describes what his brother Abraham writes to him regarding a deceiving prophet who had appeared amidst the Saracens, and Abraham recalling a conversation with a Jewish scribe who called the prophet a deceiver who comes with a sword and chariot. Isn't it getting confusing? Nonetheless, you have to read it so you understand what we're talking about. That's number 1. Number 2, he goes to the Thomas the Presbyter in 634, citing a battle between the Romans and the followers of Muhammad. Notice with the T, not with the D. And number 3, a Syriac flyleaf fragment from 636, which mentions Muhammad by name, he says. And this is what it says. Many villages were ravaged by the killing of Muhammad. Muhammad, not Muhammad. And the Coptic bishop John Niku, he puts it at 641, but actually it's written in 690, refers to him as the detestable doctrine of the beast. That is Muhammad. No, not one of these references uses the name Muhammad. They all use Muhammad or Muhammad. Let's go for each one. The Doctrine and Jacobi, a Greek Christian polemical tract written in Carthage. Now here's my problems. It mentions the Saracen prophet. It never mentions the name Muhammad or Muhammad anywhere. And it says that the Christ who was to come. Hold on a minute. Is Muhammad the Christ who is yet to come? No, that confronts chapter 33, verse 40. And they assume that Muhammad is alive in 634, but according to the traditions, he died in 632. He had the keys of paradise, which confronts the Islamic traditions. This prophet fits a Judeo-Christian, monotheistic background. This Christ, this Christos in Greek, this Mashiach in Hebrew, who was to come, not Muhammad. He has the keys to paradise. That comes from Matthew 16, verse 90, referring to Peter's papal authority in the Catholic Church. And this Muhammad, or this Saracen prophet, who doesn't have the name Muhammad, spoke Aramaic. I don't recall Muhammad ever speaking Aramaic. So, coming and going, there is no reference to the name Muhammad in this tract, no reference to the prophet being a Muslim or belonging to the religion of Islam, nor any reference to the city of Mecca, nor of his book, the Quran. He could be anybody. In fact, he sounds more like an Arab Christian brigand, employing the status of a prophet to gain for himself more credibility and authority. There's just nothing Islamic about this Saracen prophet. What about the Thomas the Presbyter? Later revised in the 8th century, and refers to a battle between the Romans and the Tayyip of Muhammad. Notice Muhammad is the Pahlavi spelling, which means he has to come from Iraq, if he's Pahlavi. That's how they spelled it up there. And that he would have come from our present-day Iraq, which is 1,200 miles to the north. He is a Tayyip. That's the Muhammad of the Tayyip, dominated by the Lakhmad region. You can see on the map where the Lakhmads are. They're way up in Mesopotamia, in Tajikistan in the 7th century. Note on the map where the red circle is where the Tayyip were located. Way too far to the north to be the Muhammad of the Hijaz of Central Arabia. He fights in near that far north. As before, he could be any Muhammad or any praised one, someone who's referred to as the praised one, an honorific title for the leader of the Tayyip way up in northern Iraq. And then you have the Syriac flyleaf, which refers to this battle in Yarmouk in 636. Notice where Yarmouk is. It's in what is today southern Syria. The Arabs of the Muhammad who have a battle with the Gabita in Yarmouk. My problem is the battle is well documented, but note that it says Arabs. So who were the 7th century Arabs? Look at the map up there, and you will see where that red rectangle is. They lived in today's Jordan and Syria, not in the Hijaz. So way too far to the north to be the Muhammad of Islam. The Byzantines at that battle, but according to the standard Islamic narrative, Muhammad died in 632. What was he doing in 636 in the battle? Could this be yet another of 7th century northern Muhammad, thus someone who is simply referring as an honorific praised one? And then he goes to the Coptic bishop Niku, and he writes this: embrace the religion of the Muslims, the enemy of God, and the acceptance that there is no one called Muslims in the 7th century. But look at the date, 690. What's he calling Muhammad with the vowels in place? What does that tell you? There were no vowels in the 7th century. The earliest manuscript of this is quoted in 1602 from an Ethiopic translation from the Arabic, which was from an earlier Greek translation, none of which exists today. Again, that this is a later redaction back to the 7th century. So there was no reason why to use that, because it's way too late. This comes from the 17th century. It's a fraud. Now, what about Christian record? Let's use the crucifixion, probably the most important event in the history of mankind. What does Islam do? What does this book do with the crucifixion? Well, in one verse, it shuts down the crucifixion. Has another man die in Jesus' place, puts him on the cross instead of Jesus, saying that there was no crucifixion. And in one verse, it just shuts down everything we know about Jesus Christ. That's what the Quran does. Is that historical? No. Why do we go back to the evidence from the 1st and 2nd century? Why do we go back to Thales and Phlegon, these two Greek Samaritan historian and Roman, right, who were debating this event in 52 AD? That's 20 years after Christ died. And in the debate, they mentioned that when Christ died, the earth shook and the sun went dark. Don't you think you'd rather trust them than the Quran that was written in the 7th and 8th century? I'd go to the 1st century, wouldn't you? What about Lucian the Greek satirist that refers to the death of Jesus Christ? Or Bar Seraphim, who has a letter to the pagan in 73 AD? Or what about the Jewish historian Josephus, who in between 83 and 90 AD not only talks about the death of Jesus, but he mentions also the brother of Jesus, James' death, and he mentions that the Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Ooh, well of that. And then what are we going to do with Tacitus, a Roman historian who hated Christians, had nothing good to say about Christianity, yet he talked about the death of Jesus, that happened during the time of Pontius Pilate under the rule of Tiberius. That's why we know it's from 33 AD, because of Tacitus. So I've given you Greek, Roman, and Jewish historians from the 1st and 2nd century who all agree that it was Jesus who was on the cross. Yet even with just this example, we can see that Christianity has a far better record than Islam historically because of the outside hostile historical evidence. Now, what about the textual record we have? Remember I said earlier that we have the tafsir and the tahqiq and the hadith and the sirah of Jesus? And we have it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also the writings of Paul. Remember I said that? Let's do a comparative. Now, I'm going to step on all your toes. You're not going to like what I'm going to do next, because you're not going to like the dates I did, but I'm going to put the most liberal dates I can find. But I'm doing that for a purpose. Let's see when they were written down, and let's see how earlier they are. So when you talk about Jesus, we talk about the tahqiq. That would be the histories of the early church written by Luke in the book of Acts, written between 52 and 62 AD. Churches, that's the tafsir of Jesus. That was written between 48 and 65 AD, within 15 to Christ. Then you have the next two of Matthew and Luke, written in 80 AD. That's 47 years after Christ. The last hadith written by John in 90 AD. That's 57 years after Christ. Within 60 years, you have the entire New Testament. Within 60 years. Notice that all of these writers, all of these New Testament writers lived in the same place Jesus lived, and they either knew him personally or they got the material from others who saw what he did and heard what he said. So, comparing Christianity versus Islam. When was the earliest biography saying for the both faiths? When we look at Christianity, everything comes together within 60 years of Christ, written by those who either saw or heard what he did and heard what he said, or those who got it from them. Whereas when we look at Islam, everything we know about Muhammad, what he said and he did, comes from 400 to 900 years later. Which would you guess is more authoritative? Are you listening to this, Abdul? Are you starting to get the idea? You got a problem here. Yeah, no answer. Just put your thumb up. You're starting to come around. As a comparison, if we had to depend on sources for Jesus, comparable to what the Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd to 5th century. How would we defend him? With statistics like these, how can Raymond suggest that Muhammad is much more historically supported than Jesus? Supposition number 3. If Muhammad did not exist, how do we understand the Sunni-Shia divide? This is what he says. If Muhammad didn't exist, then no descendants existed either. So how can we understand the Sunni-Shia divide? Why would there be a huge contention involving the blood descendants of a man who had never existed? Now, to begin with, the first we even hear about Ali as Muhammad's choice is with Sahih Bukhari, volume 5. While the other counter-argument, which goes against that, exactly contradicts it, is also found in Sahih Bukhari, volume 5, book number 64, proving that his companions didn't even know what side they were on. Remember, the canonical version of Sahih Bukhari does not appear until the 14th to 15th century, so this is probably a much later story redacted back. But most importantly, this is a political dispute between Persians and Arabs, not theological. So it could have been created at any time by either the Abbasids or the Ottomans in the 14th and 15th century, and then redacted back first to al-Bukhari and then to the person of Muhammad himself, in order to give authority to whichever position, Persian or Arab, you needed for that time and for your place. This is not surprising, as movements, both political and religious, often split, and the Sunni-Shia divide could easily have arisen for the same reason as the earlier Abbasid revolt, which at its very roots was due to disquiet over the earlier Umayyad dynasty. And here is another response. I'm not going to read through this. You can read through it on your own time when you get the PowerPoint by Dr. Pat Andrews. He just shows you, if you have that from, what are you going to do with the King Arthur and Camelot legend? Did Camelot really exist? Was there a round table? Was there a stone with a sword in it that little King Arthur had to pull out? Well, Disney made that one up. And it still be made up even today. Legends are exactly that. They get concocted, they get recreated, they get embellished, they get deleted and treated century after century, depending on what your needs are. And that's exactly what we're finding with the Sunni-Shia divide. What about his reference to there are no incontrovertible proofs of Muhammad's non-existence? Boy, that's a mouthful. My response, I don't have to prove a thing here. The statement makes no sense to begin with. How can someone prove someone who did not exist? It is the person who claims that someone did exist who bears the burden of proof, not me. Okay? I'd throw that right back. Nobody else would agree with that. Don't say yes. Say, ooh, that's something I haven't thought about. Raymond admits in his video that he hasn't even looked at our evidence. Why in the world is he confronting me if he's not even looking at my videos? That shows you right away that the fact that he hasn't even looked at arguments suggests that he is either naive or simply arrogant, or is being typically Arabic with his one-upmanship style. I think it's the latter. The theories we have, Raymond believes, are only out there. The reason I'm doing this, he says, is because those of us who perpetuate them use it simply out of a dislike for Islam. Folks, he is correct. I do dislike Islam, but I absolutely love Muslims. Do you see the distinction I'm making? I love this one. This is what David Wood took me on about 2 years ago. We had a debate on this very subject. And he said, Jay, how can you have this? Look at all the things he did wrong. Look at all the weaknesses he had. He was deceitful. He killed his enemies. He married a 7-year-old girl and consummated when she was 9 and he was 53. Ooh, that's just terrible. How can you look at this guy? He was demon possessed. He tried to commit suicide. He goodness sakes, he started wearing female clothes like he was a transvestite. How can you invent somebody like that, Jay? Here's the problem. The difficulty is this. Raymond and David Wood, they are embarrassed by Muhammad because they're comparing him to Jesus. Therefore, they're looking at Muhammad through the grid of Christian cultural views of Muhammad, and they want him to be Jesus, but he will never be Jesus. No one can compare to Jesus. Of course, for us, he's absolutely embarrassing. But Muslims don't do that. They don't look at Muhammad through the grid of. Therefore, they love his virility. They love his violence and his denigration of others. In fact, Muslims, whenever I bring this up, they tell me this. Compared to Jesus, Muhammad is much greater than Jesus. He never married, he had no family, he never ruled, he never went to war, he never stood up against his oppressors, he never owned anything, he was a wimp. That's what they tell me. I want to follow Muhammad. He went to war. He had children. He controlled the whole country. He is his mouth over the Muslim world today, and he was a man. Hoorah. Jesus was a woman. For a Muslim, they love Muhammad because of that. We hate him because he's not like Jesus. Be careful, folks. The more you show these things to Muslims, the more they agree with you. Absolutely. Why don't you come on home? He's a much better man than Jesus. What kind of model is Jesus? Did do anything I want to do. What's more, if you're looking at his depression or his attempted suicide, his demon possession or his cross-dressing, even his homosexual tendencies, which Raymond loves to talk about, David Wood, they love to go on this. These are typical crises of every prophet. Every prophet goes through these crises. But they overcome every one of them. He didn't remain depressed. He didn't continue to wear dresses. He didn't commit suicide. Otherwise, he wouldn't have lived. Every prophet goes to them, and then they conquer them. And by conquering them, they prove and they show to us what we can do, proving that they were true prophets. The same happened to Muhammad, a true prophet, because he surmounted these problems in their eyes. So be careful about using that argument, folks. Every time I use that argument, Muslims want to invite me to tea. Say, yes, thank you. Why don't you come back to Muhammad? What a guy. Hoorah, he's my man. Supposition number 6. Mecca is not an argument against Muhammad. Ooh, boy, I love this one. No, Raymond did not watch any of our videos on Mecca. His response suggests that we are simply arguing from science, and an absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence. He says that in his video. I couldn't believe that he was actually quoting I forgot his name, Jamal Badawi from the last century. At some point in the future, references for Mecca will exist. My response, if there was no Mecca, then it doesn't matter what Muhammad or Mahdi you find. If he does not come from Mecca, then he is not Muhammad of Islam. So it absolutely does matter that Mecca existed. In my